news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, come up in this hour, we're going to check in with Sam Fazeli, Bloomberg Intelligence Director of Research. He covers all the pharmaceuticals. I'm going to talk to him about this Sanofi-Novavax deal that John Tucker's been reporting on all morning, and the Novavax stocks is like up 100%. What is going on there? We'll check in with Dr. Fazeli there. It's Friday. That means we talk municipal bonds.
Bam.
Today with Eric Kazatsky, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Municipal Bond Strategist, and then Alan Schweier, Principal Researcher, Human Capital at the Conference Board, to discuss the board's national survey about how satisfied Americans are with their jobs following the Great Resignation. I bet you there's some interesting stuff there. I'm very happy, very satisfied. And I'm sure Charlie Pellet's very satisfied. He's been doing it forever. Charlie Pellet, he's got our Bloomberg Business Flash. Charlie, what do you have for us?
And here's what's going on. We have got the Dow, the S&P, they are higher. NASDAQ in the red right now. Stocks are trimming gains. This Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with the solutions they need to grow a thriving business. Commonwealth, go where you grow. Visit commonwealth.com to learn more. Stocks have trimmed gains. Bond yields rose after data this morning pointed to an economy that is slowing amid stubborn inflationary pressures, posing a challenge to the outlook for Federal Reserve rate cuts. Here's where we stand. S&P up 4, a gain of just about 0.1%. Dow Industrials up 95, up 0.2%. NASDAQ in the red right now, down 24, a drop there of 0.1%. 10-year 4.49%, the 2-year 4.85%. Spot gold up $11 the ounce, up another $11 to $23.58. That is a gain now of 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude, we'll call that unchanged on the day, $79.24 a barrel. Larry Adam is Chief Investment Officer for Private Wealth at Raymond James Financial, and he says we are in the early stages of a bull market.
No, I still think we're early, because I do think that the Fed is going to cut rates before the end of this year. I think they'll take out some insurance cuts, which will elongate the recovery that we're in, and that will ultimately set up this bull market to last for the years to come.
Larry Adam of Raymond James. One of the stocks we're keeping an eye on today, Sweetgreen, the salad chain. The stock is surging after it increased its annual sales projection and said profitability is improving as it expands its footprint. Right now, Sweetgreen shares, they are jumping by 39.8%. Recapping, stocks mixed. S&P little change now, up by less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so very much. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney, Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and economics through a lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also keep you updated on all the movers that you need to know every morning. And for that, we're going to go to Jess Menton right now, who I like you're mixing up a little bit. You're going with the TSMC. They had some good numbers, right?
They did. Just TSM is the ticker symbol for this. So if you look at the stock, it's up about 5% this morning. Also on pace for its best day since March 7th. Looking at annually, though, that stock's up actually more than 43%, close to 44%. So you're seeing, especially when you think about what this ties into, because it is the world's largest contract chip maker, and people keep a close eye on this because of its relationship with NVIDIA. So that was its U.S. listed ADR when I was talking about those share moves there. So the Taiwanese chipmaker did say that its revenue for April actually soared 60% on the year. So it was sustained AI demand, not surprisingly there. And that was what was helping the beginnings of a recovery when we are looking at consumer electronics. So the global smartphone industry returned to growth over the first 3 months of this year. So that does include the highly competitive Chinese market. So that does potentially drive orders for TSMC's traditional mainstay of mobile chips. And then also looking at this stock, though, it did actually soar to an all-time high back in April. So it definitely remains in this enviable position just because of its benefit and the rise of AI technology, because it is, not surprisingly, NVIDIA's sole manufacturer for most of its advanced training chips. And we do have NVIDIA's earnings coming up on May 22nd. So a little bit under 2 weeks. I know Paul's excited for that one.
And so is the market.
The last of the Magnificent Seven stocks to report.
Very good. Anything else we got here?
So I know you and Tom Keene earlier this morning were talking about the Dow getting closer to that 40,000 threshold. So I was crunching some of the numbers here. Yes. So the first time it crossed 30,000, it was November 24th of 2020. So it's been roughly 868 trading sessions through yesterday since the S&P, or since the Dow rather had crossed the 30,000 threshold. So we're getting close to obviously 870 sessions there. So it'll be interesting to see when it tops that threshold, but that was November of 2020 when it first crossed 30,000. So that was another one I was keeping a close eye on. And then I also have we have an earnings watch column for our equities team that we run. So we have a story running tomorrow where I was looking at some of the revision momentum from Bloomberg Intelligence, so Gina Martin Adams' team, looking on the next 12-month basis if you see analysts upgrading companies that are related to energy. So I know Alex keeps a close eye on energy companies as well as discretionary stocks and communication services. So those clearly house a lot of those big tech and Magnificent Seven companies, but those are getting revised up the most over the next 12 months. And then also, if you look at the current second quarter, the revisions are happening at the swiftest pace since coming out of COVID because of those depressed levels. And when we saw that earnings growth spike really strongly back in 2021 and parts of 2022 before we were in a bear market in the S&P 500. So the reason that you're not seeing the upgrades happen in the second half of the year, because if you look at the EPS estimate for the S&P 500, it's still around 245. So if you looked last May to now, it hasn't budged, but in between then it jumped around a lot. And it's because not every company gives out quarterly guidance or annual guidance. So quarterly guidance, it's about a quarter of companies in the S&P 500, and then about 50 to 60% of companies give out annual guidance. So Wendy Song, who's on Gina's team at Bloomberg Intelligence, she was talking about how it might be like a quarter by quarter basis until we see those estimates budge for the second half of the year. But if you look at the current quarter, those are being marked up a lot, and it's more of industrial companies, material companies, and energy companies. So clearly cyclical companies that are tied to the health of the economy.
And data centers.
That's right.
Also, she said all those numbers without looking at a paper. I'm just going to put that out there.
I wrote the story, so it's fresh in my mind.
Really dug that. Jess Menton, thank you.
Talking about just about the people happy at work. Is there anybody happier or comes in with a bigger smile, more positive energy than Jess Menton?
I feel like Alex does, though. Alex is always
good.
positive.
Peggy Collins, who runs the economic team over in D.C. The two of them together. I've had conversations with Mike McKee being like, do you think that they rage when they get home, or like are they just this happy all the time? Because when you know, not on air, Paul and I won't talk to anybody, but like Jess is always ready to chat.
Plus, when you put Jess next to John Tucker, the juxtaposition.
Chatty Cathy's over here.
You see the difference. Jess, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Jess Menton from Bloomberg News. Just some breaking news coming from the Wall Street Journal. President Biden apparently is set to quadruple tariffs on Chinese EVs. So we broke the story overnight, but the Journal gives some numbers to it. They say the EV tariff rate is expected to rise to roughly 100% from 25%. Now, this all comes to a review of Section 301 tariffs that were first put in place under Trump starting in 2018. And these new tariffs are focusing on EVs, batteries, and solar cells, with existing levies being largely maintained. Paul, we spoke earlier, it probably won't affect the actual EV sales because they don't really sell that much anyway, but nonetheless, the signal very clear.
Yeah, Steve Mann was just kind of bringing it up. You know, he covers the autos for Bloomberg Intelligence. Like, we don't buy many, if any, Chinese EVs here, so it's kind of but it's certainly a shot across the bow in terms of the intention there. Maybe it's a little bit more political than anything else.
And you have to wonder for the solar panel stuff, like, that usually goes through third-party countries and then comes here. But nonetheless, is this the road that we're kind of going down? Which, again, my question is, how are we actually decarbonizing if we're doing that? But anywho, I digress.
Good point. All right, I think the stock story of the day, Novavax shares surged after the company signed a $1.2 billion license agreement with Sanofi that includes commercializing a combined COVID-19 and flu shot. Stock's up like crazy, over 100%. I saw the news. I'm like, okay, it's important, but
like
it's not ripping the stock. So
it's like a $2 biotech company.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Let's get Sam Fazeli on here. He covers all this pharmaceutical stuff for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's based in London, but we never know where he is, and we don't ask. We've been told not to ask because he's got various places. Sam Fazeli joins us here. Sam, talk to us about this Sanofi Novavax transaction. How do you view this?
Yeah, so thanks for having me back on. I am in France actually today. It is Friday after all. Yeah. Well, there you go. I can see them from here. It was a bit of a surprise for me, to be honest. Sanofi is a vaccine powerhouse themselves. So the fact that they've signed up to this vaccine, which I have to say, in the days of COVID, although it was tough for them to manufacture and get it over the line in the same speed that the mRNA vaccine folks were doing, it was a good vaccine. It induced good immunity. It did, I think the UK used some of it, but it obviously never really got traction. It's tough to be a small company and do this in the vaccine world in a standard, old-fashioned, if I would say, type of vaccine, although their technology is quite cutting edge.
So Barclays had a note out that talked about that maybe this was just Sanofi trying to cement its role in the flu vaccine, and this was just a way to do that. Is there truth to that? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, truth, who knows what the truth is, but the reality, I think, is that I don't think is about COVID. I think this is about the fact that Sanofi is one of the biggest players in the flu vaccine market. Pfizer and Moderna are both trying to developing a combination flu-COVID. And let's put it this way. If you take your COVID shot every year, if you take your flu shot every year, which is much bigger market than COVID in terms of volume, wouldn't you prefer, like when you go in, say, you've got a combo? Yeah, why not? Just put it in my arm. So there was a risk for Sanofi that they would end up in a place where the flu vaccine business was under pressure from these combos. And the way to solve that in the so-called old-fashioned way of vaccine making, protein vaccines, is this. Could they have done it themselves? Maybe. I mean, they have tried. They had to deal with Glaxo when they were trying to do manufacturing of a COVID vaccine. But clearly, here's one that's ready-made potentially for them to launch into the 2025 season is what they're talking about.
So, I guess let's talk broadly defined. What is like the COVID vaccine rate like in the most recent year? I mean, is it one of those things that's just dropping and will maybe eventually get to just a lower level? Because it seems like here in the U.S., nobody got their shots, it seems like.
Folks are getting it, that's for sure. Remember that I think the people who are incentivized definitely to take it are those who are at risk, i.e. risk of a cardiovascular disease or something else, so they have a immunological issue. So older folks who don't have the immune system that you have, the young man that you are, Paul, in then fighting it and making sure that your vaccine memory is good enough. So those have taken, and Moderna is talking about a $4 billion revenue this year as a nadir, and they all talk about if we had the same volume as flu, it could be so much bigger market. And one way of getting that is to combine the two vaccines together. Just make that so much easier for people to say yes.
And let's be clear, I also get all my vaccines because COVID loves me. It loves underlying conditions, and it loves Alex. It stays, it loves me, it gives me lots of fun symptoms for a very long period of time. There was a report out earlier, though, that talked about Moderna's mRNA combined flu and COVID vaccine potentially not necessarily being any better than like Sanofi's regular old one. What does that mean for mRNA technology?
Yeah, we don't need better. We just need as good as. And let's put it this way. A lot of these comparisons that are being made on what we call antibody responses, not actual saving you from going to hospital. That's the thing that would be needed to do a big trial to compare hospitalization rates. And it's possible that one of these vaccines is going to do better on that, but time will tell. If it's not better, it doesn't matter because you're increasing the opportunity for people to get a shot. You're giving them an easy one-shot combo. These mRNAs are easier to change. If the strain changes, then get them to people faster. So, this is, I think, the direction it's going to go. Get the vaccine to people faster as the strains change, and combination, because who wants to be a pincushion?
Exactly. So Novavax, I mean, I remember this company having a tough 2023, Sam, and had to issue a going concern warning about its ability to continue operating. Is this just the turnaround of all time in your industry?
Yeah, it looks like it, right? I mean, it's day one, right? So let's see how they manage going forward. And there's still a lot more to do. Can you manufacture? What is actually a complex process to make this? They have a very interesting way of getting these proteins into structures that the human body sees and goes, wow, I need to raise an immune reaction to this. So, but that's cool, except that complicated to manufacture. Now you have Sanofi behind you with their ability and capability in manufacturing and getting to market. It should be better, right? The other thing is today's stock reaction is, I think, a lot to do with what you just said, Paul. It was a going concern issue. And look at the numbers today. It looks like on the surface that they raised their guidance, right? From 800 to $1 billion of sales to 8 something or 9 something and 1 billion, 1.1 billion. But a whole chunk of that is the upfront payment from Sanofi. So in reality, if this hadn't happened, the company would have had to cut its guidance by 50% or so. Now, at the bottom end, so 800 to 400, that looks like a hefty number. And I don't know how the market would have reacted to that. I think the stock would have evaporated today if it wasn't for this deal. So well done to the management team to get it done.
All right, Sam, if I were to come to the south of France today, it looks like about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, sunny, beautiful.
Yeah.
What bottle of wine would you treat me to if I came to your homestead here? What would we open up on a late afternoon or evening?
I think we'll open up a bottle of wine from my local friend here, Jean-Noël, who makes a very nice white, because we're having fish tonight. It's Friday after all, right? So we're having fish tonight. And he makes a really lovely Semillon-based white wine. Very affordable.
So I'm guessing you're not
euros.
going to Taylor Swift then?
No, not tonight.
But no, Sam, I wanted to go into the part of your wine cellar where I'm not allowed to go because it's too expensive.
Yeah, he doesn't want the local thing. He wants the real deal.
Oh, yeah, the Chassin Montrachet. I can take you in with virtually if you like.
All right, we'll see how that goes.
And show you how I taste the bottle.
Yeah, like I send photos of to Sam of the bottles I get at restaurants, and he just kind of
what did I say?
Puts me like a frown emoji, or uses.
No, you've done one or two who were really good.
Okay,
but I'm betting that your local guy, like, that's not going to be an insanely expensive wine, right?
No. Really delicious wine, very affordable, wonderful wine.
All right, Sam, enjoy that this evening in the south of France. Again, 80 degrees and sunny for those there. Good luck to that. Sam Fazeli, he runs our research over there for Bloomberg Intelligence, also is the one of the top pharmaceutical healthcare analysts in the city of London. So he's got it all wired down. He's our go-to guy for all this stuff. And again, Novavax, wow. NVAX is the ticker symbol, up 125% here. Was a $5 stock to start the day. Now it's a $10 stock. So kind of pretty good day to be a shareholder of Novavax. S&P 500, I'm calling it unchanged. The Dow's up about 0.2%, 39,450 on your Dow Jones Industrials, and Nasdaq's off about 0.1%. So a quiet day from the index level here in New York. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We're looking at a mixed Friday morning here. The Dow, the S&P, they are higher. S&P little change. NASDAQ in the red. And this Bloomberg Business Flash is brought to you by BNY Mellon Insight. June 4th to the 6th in Nashville, Tennessee. Don't miss the essential event for the financial advice community. Visit insight.bnymellon.com. The stock market is losing traction. Bond yields are rising after data pointed to an economy that is slowing amid stubborn inflationary pressures, posing a challenge to the outlook for Federal Reserve rate cuts. S&P now higher by 1 point, little change there. The Dow up 58, up 0.1%. NASDAQ in the red by 22 points, down 0.1%. 10-year 4.49% with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.85%. Spot gold is higher by 0.7%, 23.62 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.1%, 79.20 for a barrel of WTI. A topic we were just talking with our Sam Fazeli about. Novavax shares are surging after the company signed a $1.2 billion licensing agreement with Sanofi that includes commercializing a combined COVID-19 and flu shot. Shares of Novavax, they're up now by 127%. Recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P up 3, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Now on Bloomberg Intelligence, Munis in Focus.
All right, Focus on Munis today is brought to you by Build America Mutual. Build America Mutual insures U.S. municipal bonds that finance essential American infrastructure and provides guaranteed income to improve any portfolio. Be part of building America. Invest in BAM Insured.
Bam.
There you go.
How's that?
It's all right. It's
Yeah,
okay.
wasn't that good?
It's
Okay.
You know Matt Miller. I mean,
I know. You can't beat that.
That's
you know?
tough on the beat. All right, so it is a Friday. That means we talk municipal bonds. That means we bring in our good friend Eric Kazaski, Senior Municipal Bond Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. He joins us via Zoom from Princeton. Hey, Eric, I want to ask about the ETF business and kind of how that's playing in the municipal bond space. I would think the ETF wrapper would be a really attractive way for investors to get exposure to the ETF market. Explain to us how that's kind of been developing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good morning. And Howie's happy to join you guys. You know, ETFs for municipals are something a lot of people still aren't familiar with, even though they, prior to 2024 have been one of the highest growth areas for all fixed income ETFs, right? So it's really been that cheap beta, low cost passive option that has really helped both like BlackRock and Vanguard just become predominant, leaders in the space. And, aggregately, together the both of them have about $70 billion of munis under management, which is pretty impressive because, 10 years ago, these products were non-existent. What we are seeing now, though, Paul, is super interesting, is that growth rate has started to slow a little bit, which is interesting because what we're actually seeing is more money come into the active side of the market. So it's showing that people, want a more active approach, are willing to pay a little bit more in fees, to get a little bit more hand-holding this year. So super interesting.
But I thought the whole point of owning munis is you buy them and you let them sit and then you clip the coupon and the tax stuff. And why would you want active strategies?
Well, that's a really great question, right? And you could pose that to any of the mutual fund managers, and they're going to tell you you want active because not only do you want to clip that coupon, but you want total return too, right? So, in years prior, except the last 2 years, the total return portion of that strategy was really something to go out and sell on, right? Like, hey, we have higher yielding returns when it comes to, other corporate options, other fixed income options, even equities in some years. So that, as well as getting that tax exempt income stream, really positive selling points. And I think people want the diversity and sort of the active management role where you have someone overseeing a broader portfolio and rotating out of things before problems pick up as well. You're really not going to get that when you're just passively following a benchmark.
Is there a seasonality on an annual basis to how municipal bonds trade or perform?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things we love talking about each time this time of year comes, right? So the spring has sprung, great things going on in the muni market, returns are turning positive, and in just one short month, we're going to get into the heaviest cash redemption season of the entire year. So over June, July, and August, about $150 billion coming back to investors. Ultimately, what does that mean? A lot of money chasing a lot less paper that's around. Yes, supply is up about 30% year over year, but we can't bank on that sort of trend keep going over the summer or even into, full on election season.
What are the trends you're noticing right now?
I mean, overall, we're liking the trends that are setting up, from spread compression. So, we have seen returns come back to the muni market. The year started off pretty rough, but this has been a pretty decent May. Right now returns are 1.11%. So that puts it ranked around, 7th best May over the last 20 years. So it has been a very strong month. Yeah. So, we're hoping that trend continues for the rest of the month. I know rates are a little softer today. We'll see. But, I think overall, there's a lot going on in the overall economy. It's telling us that it's softer. The Fed can't quite cut yet. But, that really hasn't translated to the muni market. And I think that's one of the sort of a story of resiliency that we're talking to a lot of investors about.
So you mentioned a new issue market up this year. What's driving that, and any trends there that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, our good buddy Joe Mysak wrote about this just the other day, right? It's been a proliferation of issuance based on a lot of folks refinancing their debt, even at these higher rates. These rates do seem higher, but they're still low historically. And a lot of new issuance, right? People just can't wait around and see what the Fed is going to do as far as, future rate direction. They're certainly not willing to wait around and see what happens with the, the election in November from a tax standpoint. So, look, could we be pulling forward some of that issuance, from people just trying to sort of get a jump on some more uncertainty coming down the road? Certainly. But like we've talked about in prior conversations, there is a certain amount of spend that needs to get done on the state and local level just to keep the lights on, right? To keep the good repair at bay. So that's what we're seeing right now.
Did we ever talk about this, like the tax season, and you got to sell the stuff to pay for taxes? I read a lot about the equity market, and that maybe the selling pressure that we did see was because of people having to pay taxes. Does the muni market get subject to the same kind of thing?
Unfortunately, right? I mean, so look, having worked on the asset management side of this business, I can tell you that each and every April, people look to their muni portfolio to help pay their tax bills. Never really quite understood it because to your earlier point, these should be buy and hold securities. What was really frustrating is that you sort of help someone get fully invested in March and they turn around in April and sell out the entire portfolio to help pay a tax bill. Really sort of looked at as almost like a quasi money market vehicle. But, it's just something that we contend with in the municipal space and something that we haven't really seen change. And that was reflected in some of the softer performance that we saw last month.
What's is it, the high yield muni space? Has that been where the best returns have been?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're outperforming AAA munis by well over 120 basis points, outperforming IG munis, almost by that amount as well. It's been a really interesting time in the high yield space. We're putting out a report next week, and we actually like high yield munis a lot more than high yield corporates. Look, spreads are tight across all of fixed income, but I think on a dollar for dollar per unit of risk basis, high yield munis would certainly be where I was looking if I want to be involved in a little bit more of a credit play.
Like where? Like what? High yield munis. Like what areas are normally high yield munis?
Well, there's a lot of subsectors, right? The one we wrote about just this week was high yield tobacco bonds. A lot of folks aren't familiar with. Yeah, absolutely. So there was a master settlement agreement done with the National Association of State Attorney Generals with the big tobacco companies based on all the damage that smoking had done. So they securitized the future damages and payouts from those lawsuits, and a lot of states were able to sort of borrow against those future payments and thus securitize them. So a lot of those earlier issuances fell into the high yield muni market. At one point they were about 15% of the high yield muni market, but those are fundings that have inevitably come along to all parts of the market, restructured a lot of those deals and moved them over to the investment grade side of the market. So now they only make up about 6% of high yield, but still a super interesting place, from a credit standpoint. We talk about defaults and historical defaults, and historically high yield munis have a really low historical default rate, especially compared to high yield corporates. So, from that aspect, certainly something I think investors should be mindful of.
You look a little lonely there in the Princeton office here today, Eric.
Oh boy.
It is. No Ira, no one shooing on the left side of me. It is pretty Spartan today.
Yes, to be fair, it's gross out. I'd be staying at home, working from home if I could.
Yeah, well, it's especially as you get into the summer Fridays, why not? But we appreciate Eric showing up in the office, giving us the update on the municipal bond market. We thank you, as always, Eric Kozaski, Senior Municipal Strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, all alone in the Princeton office for Bloomberg Intelligence. I think that's just the way it is now in corporate America.
Oh my gosh, yeah, seriously. So I take my car in. I get it at 6:30, right? a little bit before maybe. Coming in on Fridays is the fastest day.
Because nobody's going.
Because no one's in, or maybe they're going to go in later.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Mondays, like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays stink.
Yeah.
But Mondays is iffy, but it's picked back up. So it does feel to me it's a Monday through Thursday in office jam. Friday, nah.
And here's a Jersey Shore perspective. It used to be Friday afternoons people would leave early to go down to the shore. Now it's Thursday.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because we tend to go down on Thursday afternoon, and that's when we see traffic.
Ah, because everyone can work from home. Everyone's
Yes,
working
work
home on
home on
Friday,
Fridays.
hence the Jersey Shore situation.
Yeah, so it's just changing how people, it's that whole dynamic. And I was asking the folks at BCG, we were talking to one of them about the work environment and kind of those types of things. And that dynamic they see from their clients is 3 to 4 days a week. You know, and
so people are back. So what's with the whole like we're not going to go back to the office? That's not true.
Well, I mean, I think it again. So if you're going back, it's a lot fewer people on a weekly basis in the office. Simple as that. So, but you need the space. That's what a lot of people are trying to figure out. What's the correct use of space?
Well, that's true.
I don't know. We'll see. Everybody's kind of figuring out. But if you work for some of the big banks here in New York, 5 days a week.
Do you think that's firm? Do you think
I think that's firm.
You think that's really firm?
I think that it'll get a little dicey maybe in the summer. But that's pretty firm from what I hear from over there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so we'll see. Anyway, all right, S&P 500, no change. Same for the Dow, same for the NASDAQ, just, a tenth here or there. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Alex, and Charlie. And as we've been reporting, there's word the Biden administration is set to quadruple tariffs of Chinese electric vehicles. According to the Wall Street Journal, the higher tariffs, which will be announced next week, will also hit clean energy goods from China. That includes critical minerals, solar goods, and batteries. Former President Donald Trump continued to criticize the judge in his hush money trial in New York City, a day after the judge denied a request for a mistrial over testimony from former porn actress Stormy Daniels. Before heading into court today, Trump again slammed the trial.
This case is highly unconstitutional. It's presided over by a very conflicted judge, conflicted like I've never seen before. He refuses to take himself off the case, and it should be a mistrial.
Meanwhile, Trump's former lawyer Michael Cohen is scheduled to testify Monday. One of Donald Trump's former top White House advisors has lost his appeal of his contempt of Congress conviction, paving the way for a 4-month prison sentence. Steve Bannon refused to appear before the House January 6th committee. Ukraine is set to receive U.S.-made mobile rocket systems paid for by Germany. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
These are HIMARS mobile rocket systems from U.S. stocks. They've proven to be very effective, disrupting Russian supply routes and ammunition dumps far behind enemy lines. Now, the plan was first discussed during the extended wait for aid as U.S. Congress didn't or couldn't act. Germany is set to spend the most on defense since the post-Nazi armed forces were established after World War II. The statements from Germany say that they cannot simply stand by and watch and wait as international law, global order, and values are being destroyed. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Little change on the S&P 500 index. Stock market running out of steam on this Friday. Right now, S&P up by 1 point. The Dow up 43, gain there of 1/10%, while NASDAQ is down 29 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, now a drop of 0.2%. 10-year 4.49% with a 2-year at 4.85%. Spot gold up $18 the ounce, up 0.8%, 23.64. West Texas Intermediate crude 79 even a barrel right now, down 0.3%. Again, the 10-year 4.49%. New numbers this morning on inflation. Actually, inflation coming up next week. Let's get a preview of next week's reports from Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The numbers cover early May, and they show U.S. consumer sentiment declined to a 6-month low. Americans are taking dimmer views of the outlook for inflation, jobs, and household finances. They now see prices rising at a 3.5% rate over the next year, higher than the prior month's survey and well above the Federal Reserve's inflation target. Fed officials, it should be noted, are clearly worried too. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by 0.1%. S&P up now by 0.5 point. Briefly, regulators' decision on whether to approve Moderna's vaccine for RSV has been delayed due to administrative constraints at the FDA as the company works to get its second product to market. Moderna shares there down by 3.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news and headlines with our great Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 130 industries and 2,000 companies all around the world. Here's a super interesting report that came out earlier in the week. You know the story, right? The Great Resignation. People left jobs during COVID. They got new jobs. Worker satisfaction isn't great, particularly among women. And yet, is the grass greener? It's something that if you ever contemplated leaving your job for something else, you constantly think about. Are there problems that are at every workplace, or am I the problem and I'm bringing it with me? Well, now we may have some answers to this. Alan Swire is principal researcher of human capital over at the Conference Board, and they had a survey out that said the workers who jumped ship during COVID are now regretting it. Alan, thanks for coming. This is great. I love this story. Can you walk us through your findings?
Yeah, sure. So that one specifically was a big surprise to us because just last year when we ran the survey, or in 2022, I should say, it was completely opposite to what we found this time. Every single measure of job satisfaction was up amongst those who switched jobs. But this year, overall job satisfaction was down by over 5 percentage points, and it was down across most of the 26 components of satisfaction that we measure. So a big swing, and we agree with your summary that sometimes the grass isn't necessarily greener on the other side, and it could be for a range of factors that this is happening. But we definitely see that this year those who have switched jobs during the pandemic are less satisfied than those who stayed.
Do we know what was the primary reason people did switch jobs during the pandemic? Was it any different than other times, which is maybe higher pay or just a better opportunity?
Yeah, there were really pay increases during the pandemic that we hadn't seen for well over a decade. That's fairly well documented too, that some workers were receiving 20-30% better offers just for switching jobs. And we think that maybe some people took those offers without really thinking about the other elements that lead to happiness at work and contentment at work, like who you work with and whether the organization is going to invest in your career growth and many other things. So they went for the money, maybe, and now they're starting to regret it.
I mean, it's so true. Like, the older I get, the more that I try and really distill down what makes me happy day to day, and it's so helpful. I mean, it took me a long time to figure that out, but it's so helpful in understanding it. And sometimes staying put is the answer. You had a great point out that says once an employee hits a 3-year mark, satisfaction increases substantially. Talk us through that.
Yeah, and that's also a difference from what we've seen, not only in our own research, but there's a good amount of research out there that shows that usually it's people who are short in their tenure. They start a new job, they're happy, there's a honeymoon period, and their engagement and their satisfaction levels are usually higher than people with more tenure. But this year in our satisfaction survey, we saw the opposite. And that goes with the finding that job switchers are less satisfied than job stayers, maybe for some of the same reasons. Those who switch jobs, they're the people who are in the positions with less than 3 years tenure, and they're seeing that, yeah, things aren't quite as good as they might have hoped, even if their wages are higher than if they had stayed. So that's really good reinforcement that those two elements that we examined in this report really complement each other.
And Alan, your survey kind of goes to an issue Alex and I were just talking about today. The least satisfied group is fully on-site workers. The hybrid model wins the day. I guess the hybrid model, that is the new normal for the foreseeable future, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think employers, or most employers, if not all, see the benefits of the hybrid model. You get the best of both worlds if it's done right. Some employees who can work from home may be more productive at home for some types of work. But when it comes to collaboration, building trust and relationships and innovation, they're at work for several days a week. So if they do it right, they're getting the best of both worlds. But what's really interesting is that workers see this too. Even though we see sometimes that workers say, I'd love to work 5 days remote, maybe they also see the benefits of being with their colleagues 2 or 3 days a week.
There's literally no bone in my body that ever wants to work at home again. Like the 8 weeks during COVID with a camera set up in my living room was more than enough. Are we noticing any distinction in terms of the types of jobs we're talking about, in terms of, say, women versus men, or any ethnicity?
We did see big differences with women. So for the 7th year in a row, women are significantly less satisfied than men, and that gap grew between 2022 and 2023. And, those, the main reasons or drivers of that dissatisfaction are around pay, whether that's wages or bonuses or even promotions, and also around the flexibility of work. So by that I mean some of the benefits like vacation and family leave. And it's not too surprising because we see that even in 2024, women are making 82.5 cents on the dollar for men, and that most of the burden of care, whether it's for kids or parents, and most of the household work falls on women still. So this is really reflected in results and for the past 7 years. We did not collect data on race. We are contemplating doing that, race and ethnicity, next year.
Hey, Alan, how important are some of the fringe perks, whether it's a foosball table, food, coffee machine, those things that really came to the forefront during the pandemic as employers tried to lure employees back to the office? It seems like a lot of companies made a lot of investments in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. We don't measure that specifically. We don't have a measure for sort of some of those extra perks that you're talking about, but we know, that organizations are doing their best to lure people to the office, and they're trying not to command people back to the office with those extra perks. And probably it's a good idea. Whether it has as much impact as a good health plan, probably not, or even a good, strong, talent culture where people collaborate and respect each other, probably not. But some of those things definitely help to entice people back to the office.
Just give me my coffee, I definitely don't care/want a foosball table. Alan, thanks a lot. Really interesting stuff. Great to sort of break all of that down. Alan Swire, Principal Researcher, Human Capital at the Conference Board, joining us from Savannah, Georgia. None of this surprises me, but I also wonder if our tolerance is changing. What work-life balance means in a very different way.
Yes, I think that has changed for a lot of people, and they express in different ways. Leaving the workforce, going working places that have hybrid, all that kind of stuff. So, then there are the special people like us who just come back every day.
Yeah, and to be fair, my husband does most of the child care, and he always has. So I just want to shout out that I'm not one of those women that have to do more of the child care. We love the husband. All right, this is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Sweet Green shares are surging now by 36.8% after the salad chain increased its annual sales projection and said profitability is improving as it seeks to expand its footprint. The company now anticipates same-stores growth of as much as 6%, up from a prior expectation of 5% at most. Again, Sweet Green up by 37%. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing saw April sales jump 60% to $7.3 billion as sustained artificial intelligence demand was helped by the beginnings of a recovery in consumer electronics. Mandeep Singh is a senior tech analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence.
To my mind, TSMC is the best proxy for chip demand across different sectors. So clearly they've told us, AI would be about low teens % of their overall revenue, which is a pull forward from their earlier forecast. But what this monthly number suggests is the autos and the smartphones chips demand, which was weak up until now, seem to be bottoming out. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't be reporting this kind of a bump.
Mandeep Singh with Bloomberg Intelligence. Taiwan semi shares up now by 5%. Novavax shares surging after the company signed a $1.2 billion licensing agreement with Sanofi that includes commercializing a combined COVID-19 and flu shot. Right now, Novavax is up by 126%. And Elon Musk is touting plans to expand Tesla's supercharger network just over a week after firing almost all of the roughly 500 people who ran the business. And those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
All right, this is Bloomberg Intelligence. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news and analysis with our great team over at Bloomberg Intelligence. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. We also make sure you are up to date on all the news. Here's world and national news with Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, Charlie. Donald Trump's former lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, is expected to take the witness stand Monday in the former president's hush money criminal trial. Cohen is expected to testify at length about an alleged conspiracy led by Trump to buy negative stories about his conduct with women to keep them from being published before the 2016 presidential election. Meanwhile, testimony resumed this morning in the trial. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon lost an appeal to have his 4-month prison sentence overturned. Bannon refused to testify in front of a January 6th committee on the Capitol attack. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country will fight even without U.S. help and that it must continue its offensive against Hamas and Rafah. Netanyahu discussed a potential Rafah invasion in an interview on Dr. Phil Primetime on Merritt Street Media.
In the Holocaust, we stood alone, but we were defenseless. And today, if Israel has to stand alone, we'll stand alone.
Netanyahu's comments follow President Biden's warning that he would stop additional shipments of offensive weapons to Israel should it launch an invasion to protect the more than 1 million civilians who fled to Rafah. The Biden administration is preparing to impose additional tariffs on strategic Chinese industrial exports, such as electric vehicles and batteries. According to the Wall Street Journal, they are expected to raise the tariff rate from 25% to 100%. Is something restaurants don't want to hear. A new survey finds Americans are cutting back on restaurant dining and leaving smaller tips. Brendan Sweeney, the CEO of Pop Menu, says the firm's survey shows consumers are looking for dining bargains.
80% of them are researching restaurant menus online so they can take a look at the dishes, the costs, convenience, other factors.
According to Brendan Sweeney with Pop Menu, almost 2/3 said that they'd go casual dining and about 25% said fine dining. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Alex, Paul, Charlie.
All right, thanks so much, Michael Barr. Fine dining. I haven't been to fine dining in forever.
Really?
Yeah, I have a 9-year-old, so there's that.
Well, fine dining, that's the best that White Castle can serve.
Oh, that's not a bad point. Okay, so I made Paul, in commercial break over the last 2 hours, watch the iPad ad from Apple. He'd not seen it, and I said, watch that iPad Pro ad. It was truly amazing. And for the first time, Apple issued a rare apology for an advertisement that basically touted its latest iPad Pro that upset many creative and other customers because you had this great squashing machine. What is that?
Yeah, it's like a hydraulic crusher.
It like crushes steel and
Yes.
stuff like that, or trash.
Yeah.
And it crushed everything. Like it crushed paint, it crushed a piano, it crushed art, it crushed music, instruments, the whole thing. And in the end moment, it crushes a squeezy, smiley face and its eyeballs pop out.
Yes.
And then it rises and you have this beautiful, perfect iPad.
And how thin the iPad is. I think that's I think the purpose of the whole hydraulic crusher thing was
yeah, I get
because
that.
what you got left was this paper-thin new iPad that had all the creative elements that just kind of went into it. Actor Hugh Grant said the ad promoted, quote, the destruction of the human experience.
Cool.
So the feedback from a lot of people was pretty negative. Now, it had not yet been released on television. It will not be released on television, but it's obviously out there on the internet to see. But it's actually a pretty funny ad.
So Dave Lee of Bloomberg Opinion, he had a nice note out that basically one of the reasons why the iPad ad was so upsetting is that it triggered everyone's like worst fears of AI.
Yep.
Right? Like it didn't tout the happiness of AI, but all the worst fears. And I thought it was really interesting, right? Like you think all innovation and all newness is going to go away and it's just going to be technology that runs everyone's life.
Right, so that a nice piano, a nice guitar, a can of paint that you might paint a picture with, all of those things got squished. And what you got left with is another piece of technology, hardware. So that could be a read. So anyway, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew in Washington, D.C. That starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The State Department is about to show its cards on Israel. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. With the Secretary of State now set to submit a critical report on Israel's conduct in Gaza, even as he works toward a ceasefire. We'll get the latest on what's happening here in Washington and in the region from Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security team. The Israel story, of course, weighing on the Biden campaign, even as Donald Trump tries to campaign from a courtroom in New York. We'll hit the trail with Laura Davison here at Bloomberg, and we'll have analysis this hour from our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are along for the ride. We're glad you're with us. Let's start, as always, on Wall Street. An update on trading this Friday from Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi. Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Happy Friday. We've got stocks trading mix, little changed. S&P losing traction, up now by 1 point. That is a gain of less than 0.1%. NASDAQ in the red right now. The NASDAQ Composite Index down by 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 56 now, a gain there of 0.1%. Bond yields are rising with the 10-year 4.50%, the 2-year 4.85%. Equities wavering following a report that showed consumer sentiment declined to a 6-month low. Short-term inflation expectations picked up. Spot gold up $17 the ounce, $23.63 right now, up 0.7%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.7%, $78.68 for a barrel of WTI. Well, what about politics, markets, and the U.S. election? Some thoughts from Neil Dutta, head of the U.S. Economic Research Department at Renaissance Macro.
With respect to the election, I think, who knows what the outcome is going to be. But I do think it's fair to say that if Trump were to win, former President Trump were to win, then there's a higher likelihood then that you have a unified government. And we know that whenever you have a new unified government coming out of the elections, they're always going to do something. It's not like they're going to get into office and say, hey, everyone, we're going to raise the retirement age and cut spending. They're going to want to do something that makes people feel good.
Dutta was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television. Sweet Green, after earnings, surging now by 36.7%. Recapping stocks mixed, the S&P 500 index up barely up now by half a point. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host. Here he is, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you, sir. Happy Friday, and thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. It is the Friday edition of the fastest show in politics, and great to have you with us here as we start with the matter of Israel. We're going to have the luxury later on this hour to look back on what was an important week in Congress, an important week in court for Donald Trump. But there is breaking news here on Israel and Ukraine that we're going to spend some time with. Nick Wadhams joining us from our national security team as the Secretary of State prepares to submit to Congress what's expected to be a highly critical report into Israel's conduct in Gaza. And the timing, of course, is interesting here as Secretary of State works towards a ceasefire, potentially, possibly, in Israel. Nick Wadhams is with us now. Nick, it's good to see you. I'm not sure which one I should ask you about first because we don't seem to have much news on a ceasefire. No. And the timing of a report hitting like this, just after Joe Biden was said to withhold weapons shipments from Israel, could further strain our relations. How significant is this going to be?
It's a good question because these reports, which often are congressionally mandated, can send a signal. They can be used by a country like Israel if Israel wants to make hay about it. Mm-hmm. But really, I mean, these reports have no real bearing in terms of whether they actually compel Israel to do something. I mean, clearly, though, when you're in a situation where President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, that relationship is so strained, and it just feels like we're in such a delicate moment where everything is hanging in the balance. There's the possibility of this ceasefire. You can bet that the last thing the State Department wants right now is another report that could risk pushing Bibi Netanyahu further away from the administration. I mean, it just makes things more complicated. So a delay, it's very possible that the delay is legit. They couldn't get this thing done in time. They blow through deadlines all the time with reports like this. Yeah. But it seems to me from the outside like maybe they want to give this one a little more time.
Interesting. Yeah. The timing here is everything. Right. To what extent is the Secretary of State involved in ceasefire talks versus the CIA director who seems to have been leading this?
Well, it's very interesting to see how the roles have been delegated under this administration. But what you would think of as the top diplomat, Antony Blinken, he has really ceded negotiating power on the ceasefire to Bill Burns, the CIA director. Blinken's role really now, as far as we've seen from sources we've talked to, is to focus on the humanitarian piece and that pressure on Israel to open the borders, to let more humanitarian aid flow in. You can argue he doesn't have the time. He also is too public a figure to sit himself in Cairo and do actual shuttle diplomacy in negotiations over a ceasefire. Bill Burns does not travel with a complement of 12 to 15 reporters and a motorcade of about 10 cars long. He can move with relative stealth. Folks in the region really like to talk to a spy chief. The spy chiefs in their countries are very empowered, obviously. Yeah. So is he. They see him as a much more natural interlocutor.
Well, pretty fascinating a bit of public relations here as Benjamin Netanyahu shows up on American television, and not just any television program. This is Dr. Phil.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear just a snippet of this, and you can tell me what is going on here. Here's the Prime Minister on Dr. Phil yesterday.
I've known Joe Biden for many years, so 40 years and more. We often had our agreements, but we've had our disagreements. We've been able to overcome them. I hope we can overcome them now, but we will do what we have to do to protect our country.
Who's the audience for this? And I guess they have some sort of relationship that led to this interview?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at that shot tells you so much. The birds chirping in the background, the flowers on the side, on one side, but also the Israeli flag right there. I mean, I think what you're seeing is an appeal directly to supporters of Israel in the United States to cast Prime Minister Netanyahu as just a regular guy. I mean, Dr. Phil talks to regular guys.
Right. He also talks to crazy people sometimes.
He does, which is a risk for the prime minister, though presumably they factor that in. But the messaging there, too, is also, hey, We've been friends for a long time. I'm just a straight shooter. I'm telling you how
I'm
it is.
the same guy now as I
Same guy
was then.
as I ever was. Long relationship with Joe Biden, but let me tell you, we're going to really, do this thing the way we need to do it. I think what you're seeing there is an attempt to humanize, but also it very much fits in the Netanyahu mold of doing a total end run around Democrats to go straight to Americans and to play some domestic U.S. politics.
Fascinating stuff. This is real stagecraft. Of course, this comes a day after Joe Biden was doing a little diplomacy in a CNN interview, so I guess this goes around. Nick Wadhams, I want to ask you about Ukraine while you're here, because a headline popped on the terminal right before we started talking here. Biden authorizes up to $400 million in new Ukraine military aid. Is this separate from the supplemental that he just signed? How does it work?
This is all part of that package. So what you're seeing now is the supplemental, and now the money is getting out the door. The weaponry is getting out the door. I mean, the challenge here is always one of timing. We are hearing from Ukraine that Russia is mounting a major new offensive in the Kharkiv region. Ukraine needs these weapon stocks, Patriot missiles, Stingers, things like that. These are coming from U.S. stocks, so they can get there relatively quickly. But there's always this question of a lag where you have the urgent need in Ukraine, but then the U.S. says, okay, we're going to send you these weapons. But, they may take months, certainly weeks, maybe months, maybe even years in some cases to get there. So whether this is stuff that they're going to be able to just put straight into the fight to repel this invasion, that's another thing entirely.
That's something else. We had shipments ready to go, the initial shipment, the moment that the president signed this. Do we have any reporting from the ground in Ukraine, from the battlefield, on implementation of these weapons? Has it made a difference, or is it too early to tell?
Well, it's a little early to tell, but no. I mean, they can get munitions to the front line very quickly. I mean, within days. But the bigger signal it sends, obviously, is Ukraine can feel that it can expend what artillery ammunition and the other munitions it has relatively quickly, and understanding that it will be resupplied. So what you had seen in the last few months is this real uncertainty from Ukraine. How quickly should it be allowed to expend its shells if there is a risk of running out? And so you'd seen a real amount of rationing. Now they don't have to be quite so worried about that.
Great to see you, Nick. Thank you.
My pleasure.
For helping us with all of these stories right now. If that State Department report drops on Israel, and when it does, whether it's today or later, we'll, of course, let you know here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we're spinning a couple of plates today, as you just witnessed, from Israel to Ukraine, also to Capitol Hill. We'll have more on the FAA reauthorization, with the Senate voting late yesterday to get out of town. They actually passed this 88-4. The compromise bill, so the FAA reauthorization is on track, and things are suddenly pretty quiet around here, giving us an opportunity to turn our attention to the campaign trail. Donald Trump, of course, spent the balance of the week in court, and Joe Biden has been enjoying free reign, at least to travel around the country here. There was reporting a couple of days ago in Politico that the Biden campaign is going to be dropping $15 million in ads over the course of May. Not just ads, but also hiring up for the campaign to take advantage of this moment when the former president of the United States is in criminal court in New York. Laura Davison, of course, helps to drive all of our political coverage here in Washington, and is with us at the table now. It's great to see you. Welcome back, Laura. We just finished a conversation about Israel. This matter is not getting easier. It's getting more difficult for Joe Biden on the campaign trail. As we consider the straits that Donald Trump is in court, Joe Biden is finding the walls closing in on him a bit as well. How would you frame his standing here based on what we've seen in Israel this week compared to where he was a couple of weeks back?
Well, so he's really kind of now being pulled in two directions. You know, up until a couple weeks ago, he was being pulled mostly by those more on the left who were saying, hey, you need to do more to acknowledge Gaza, acknowledge the crisis, and be harder on Israel. Now that he's come out a little bit more hard on Israel, you know, with the weapons pause, all of this, he's now getting some blowback from donors who are very strong Israel allies saying, hey, well, we thought that we had a deal and that you were going to be a very, sort of emphatic Israel supporter. So this is becoming more of an issue, you know, both on his sort of, left flank, the progressive part, as well as the major donor base, where they're split on this issue.
So it sounds like he's just making more people angry, not satisfying one side or the other with these most recent moves, certainly delaying weapons. If he's hearing from donors, this is becoming a bigger problem, not a smaller one.
Yes, and I think as it's clear that Israel is not looking to back down. Having the ceasefire fall through earlier this week, it just is clear that this is going to continue to be a protracted issue through the summer and likely into the fall. Absent some other deal cropping up, and if this is an issue that is still top of mind in October, that's a much bigger problem than for Joe Biden.
Well, that's for sure. Donald Trump certainly has had a lot to say about it, and I'm not going to get too far into his comments because we've heard before on his idea of Jews who would vote for Joe Biden. This is pretty tough language here. He calls Joe Biden's policy on Israel disgraceful. But of course, Donald Trump's got a lot of problems of his own right now, and I wonder what you see playing out as we actually hear from the likes of Stormy Daniels this week. Could be Michael Cohen next. Any potential corrosive effect this has, or is the base going to hang in there no matter what?
So what the polling shows is that the base is going to hang in, all the salacious details about, allegations of the president's sex life, all of the, what Michael Cohen might come to on his business practices isn't going to move the base. But if there's a conviction, and particularly if there is jail time, that is when you start to see in the swing states, those voters move over. So it's really all hinging on the hush money trial that's underway right now. After some developments this week with some delays in some of the other trials, it's very likely that the trial that's going right now will be the only one that will happen before Election Day. Yeah. And a conviction could come, if there is one, as soon as mid-June. But remember that Trump can appeal that, which would likely mean that, actually, sort of any sentencing, any, fulfilling of that sentence would be months later.
After the fact. This is really something. I don't know. Look, you were probably glued to the testimony this week, as many were. Everybody's wondering how exactly is the prosecution going to handle Stormy Daniels? What's the cross going to be like? Hearing her tell the story that we've really all heard before, maybe there were a couple of new details, was pretty grisly. Are we at the point now where everyone just assumes Donald Trump's affairs are part of reality, or did that actually get some attention?
It is baked in. We saw in 2016 after the Access Hollywood tape that, people just sort of assumed that, Trump has a very checkered past when it comes to women. But hearing it firsthand on the stand, and play-by-play type details, especially, questions of consent came up in some of these, this testimony as well. It just really highlights for voters who haven't heard as much from Donald Trump over the past 4 years. He's been out of the spotlight. He hasn't been president. It kind of brings up some of those things that were more front and center 4 and 8 years ago.
You just wonder, I don't know, maybe we're just completely numb to it all after the Access Hollywood tape. It's pretty hard to top that. But hearing directly from a woman speak about her experience like this is impactful.
It really is. And it'll be interesting to see, if the polling shifts, particularly on women, suburban women, in the coming weeks. This is a group that the campaign has already written off, but is very critical in deciding the outcome of the election.
So Joe Biden is leaning in. The campaign is finally putting some money to work here. We've talked so much about his campaign finance advantage. $15 million, I believe, was the number for ads, for hiring up, for organizing in May. How much can the campaign do here for itself while Donald Trump is in court?
They can do a lot. They can get their ground game fully operationalized. They can start hiring a bunch of folks. They've been opening field offices right and left. They have a fundraising advantage, and they also aren't focused on a court case. Donald Trump's team is very much focused day in and day out. He is in court, just dealing with the reaction and everything around that. Right. So they're able to focus while Donald Trump is sidetracked.
He's doing this thing in court every day. They don't even have microphones in there. He's yelling across the foyer to the lobby to reporters who are lined up. This is just the go forward, right? There's going to be no enhancement, no podium set up for him to hold a news conference. We just get the diatribe every day. It seems like the fatigue factor could be real.
It is. And, we'll see he's still using these weekends and Wednesdays to do rallies and hold campaign events. He has a bunch of fundraisers set up over the next several weeks. So he may start to get back into his campaign groove a little bit. But it's clear just from talking with his campaign folks that, this has been a big distraction for them.
Do you think he's rehearsing this stuff? Like, does he know what he's going to say? It's kind of the same every day, right? I should be in North Carolina. I should be in Michigan right now, but I'm here with you. I guess it's a little bit about Joe Biden, but I don't know. I wonder, for a guy who's kind of obsessed with performance and entertainment, if we're going to start breaking things up here a little bit.
Yeah, and this is interesting. He is very repetitive in how he speaks, and that has been true, since forever. But he does like to float and test new messages, especially if he thinks that there's a new audience that it might pick up on something.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll be following Laura Davison, as you should too, in her coverage with the whole political team here in Washington. Thank you, Laura. Hitting both campaigns here, Trump and Biden, with a lot of news as the backdrop here to what's happening on the trail. We'll talk next with Nathan Dean about what transpired on Capitol Hill in the last 24 hours. The FAA reauthorization is on track. Lawmakers are heading home. We'll have more ahead. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Zeekr Intelligent Technology up and trading. It IPO'd at $21 a share, opened at 26, and right now we're looking at Zeekr trading at 27.11. Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding. It's the high-end electric car brand under Zhejiang Geely Holding Group. It is a mixed day for the U.S. stock market. In fact, the S&P running out of steam on this Friday. S&P right now up by just 1 point, little change there. We've got the Dow up 87, up 0.2%. NASDAQ up down 27. NASDAQ lower by 0.2%. 10-year 4.50% with the 2-year 4.86%. Spot gold up $18 the ounce, $23.64 right now, up 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%, $78.59 for a barrel of WTI. Regulators' decision on whether to approve Moderna's vaccine for RSV has been delayed due to what are being called administrative constraints at the Food and Drug Administration as the company works to get its second product to market. Moderna shares today down now by 3.6%. Jim Simons, the mathematician investor who created what many in finance consider the world's greatest money-making machine at his secretive firm, Renaissance Technologies, has died. Jim Simons was 86. Again, recapping, stocks little change right now, with the S&P up 2 points. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you, and welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Charlie mentions the big IPO today, Zeekr, and going pretty well so far, as you saw. IPO price 21, opened at 26. Where are we right now? 26.44. I mention this for two reasons. A little bit later on in the broadcast, we're going to be talking with that company's chief financial officer, Jing Yuan. And the timing of this IPO is remarkable. With the headline on the terminal, Biden set to hit China EVs. This is a Chinese EV company with tariffs. Tariff rate on EVs expected to quadruple from roughly 25% to 100%, according to the Wall Street Journal. And a Chinese EV maker is going public today at the NYSE. This should be an interesting conversation once Kaylee joins us, and we are joined by Jing Yuan. Right now, it's Nathan Dean, who keeps us honest at Bloomberg Intelligence with his eye on Capitol Hill this week, and a speaker who has survived. Nathan, it's great to see you, senior U.S. policy analyst here in Washington at BI. They actually got something done last night in the Senate. It's amazing when things come up on a deadline, everybody needs to get out of town. No amendments. The FAA reauthorization moves ahead. You surprised to see this, or was this in the cards?
No, I mean, we knew it was going to happen. I mean, at least we knew that something was going to happen by that May 10th deadline. Mm-hmm. Just because, look, these things are must-pass for a reason. Now, the idea here that there were no amendments included, at least the non-germane amendments in here, it was a big disappointment to a lot of people who were trying to push marijuana banking. The Affordable Connectivity Program was not included. A lot of people in the telecommunications space wanted that. And so now the question is, what happens next? Well, it's going to be really quiet in the congressional front. Look, I hate to say this in May, but they're here June, July, they're gone August, September's the funding bill, and then they're gone in October.
Campaign season.
Exactly.
Sure.
So, there are a couple more opportunities for these bills to get attached to bigger pieces, NDAA, the funding bill, and so forth like that. But if you're hoping for a specific piece of legislation to pass, odds just keep getting a little bit lower and lower.
Well, yeah, there's a reason why we were saying this is the last train to leave the station, with an eye on stablecoin, with an eye on safe banking, as you just mentioned. Are those two on ice?
So the marijuana banking is certainly on more ice. If not, it's probably fallen through the ice at this point. Wow. I mean, look, they've tried so many times to attach things, but until I see language from House Speaker Mike Johnson, the House Financial Services Committee Chairman Patrick McHenry, or Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, until I see language from one of those three individuals saying that they're open to this idea of marijuana banking, I don't think it's going to happen. Wow. As for stablecoins, the question for me is that we've seen statements from Republicans and Democrats that they're on board with this, but where's the text? Right. We were talking about this 18 months ago.
Yes.
So I need to see where the text is, because eventually that train is going to be gone and people are going to be like, look, I'm not going to vote on anything. I got a race to run in November. Yeah. So that stablecoin bill legislation needs to come out today if we have any hopes.
Even if it did, though, moving as a standalone would be fraught with potential risk, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of those bills where I think you're going to hear a lot of people say, well, we'll try and attach it to something, but if not, lame duck. And, that was one of the biggest concerns with the stablecoin bill was that, there's bipartisan support for it. And I think they could come to an agreement, but it's stablecoins. It's not something that the Senate is going to deviate all of their time to negotiating here, especially when Senator Schumer has been hinting that the border bill could come back in late May. So
you've got to roll your eyes at that.
I do, right? But it's just one of those things where there are only so much time until they are gone and they're out campaigning and so forth like that. Stablecoins is going to have to find there's going to have to be some creative thinking to get that to the president's desk.
Boy, that's for sure. Nathan Dean with the reality check here, because the store, it sounds like, might be closed. I mean, we've got the farm bill. That's a pretty big deal, actually. But outside of that, any other major legislation moving, we're basically looking ahead to next budget season, are we not?
That's exactly it. I mean, it's like once the FAA bill passes or passed, because there was a small extension. Yeah. Once the FAA bill passes, like you said, there's the farm bill. There's this funding bill to keep the government open past September 30th. Look, there's not going to be a shutdown, and that usually means that they're going to kick the can to next year, and that usually means no big amendments get attached to that.
See you after November.
Exactly. So I think if there's a specific piece of legislation that you're hoping that gets to it, you either got to hope that it's lame duck, or you have to hope that there's so much support that everybody just says we're going to do it with debate and let's just get it through into the president's desk.
Fascinating. So what did we learn this week through the whole motion to vacate process? Because you could look at this a couple of ways. Say, hey, you know what? Mike Johnson, made man. He just survived what doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. And he's got the Democrats at his back. He's got nothing to worry about. But 11 Republicans showed up to fire him, and they're not going away. What's the rest of this Congress look like for Mike Johnson?
So I think you can view him as a caretaker speaker. I mean, look, he's going to continue to do what he does, and that is take time to analyze, get allies on his side. And there's really nothing out there that I think is really worrisome for markets. Certainly the debt ceiling is not out there. That's next year. But what Speaker Johnson also did is he just bought himself until time of next year, because next year, depending on the election, all bets are off. I mean, just look at what President Trump was saying about former House Speaker Paul Ryan this week. He's not very pleasant words for the former speaker, but a couple of years prior, he was saying great things about him. So it's almost like a transactional relationship where, the House Speaker is like going to run us through the rest of the year. He'll take care of the House, try and do his best for the Republicans in terms of campaign season, and then we'll have to see what happens in 2025.
Is there a sense, you talk to a lot of investors, they call you for your analysis. Based on the questions that you hear, is there a sense that there's some relief here, that gridlock is good, that, hey, at least we don't have to worry about Washington for the rest of the year?
So actually, I think what the investors are doing is they're taking away their focus of Congress, and they're saying, okay, Congress has given us some clarity in terms of doing stuff or not doing stuff, but now they're looking at regulators. Because now that the congressional side is going to quiet, the regulators are going to move up, because they have this Congressional Review Act deadline of early August that they have to get everything out. So don't be surprised if the Fed, the SEC, and the other regulators begin to start pushing out a lot of their rules, or even just in the non-financial space, EPA, for example, anybody, they're all trying to get out before the August season, so the investors are now moving from Capitol Hill to more of the buildings that ring the National Mall.
That's the smart take. We have Nathan Dean join us for us. So with that in mind, Michael Barr, I believe, is testifying next week. Are we going to get a Basel III update, or is this conversation taking a different direction?
I think we are going to get a Basel III update, because Katanga Johnson at Bloomberg News put out a piece just saying that they are going to get the Basel III endgame done by August. That is out of consensus. If you talk to anybody up in Midtown Manhattan, their thought was, and my thought was, is that there was a re-proposal coming. But if the Fed thinks that they can get it done by August, Michael Barr is going to have to explain why. Because there's two things here. One, you have to dramatically change the proposal to get moderate Democrats on board, but also you need to change the proposal so that it passes the courts, because there is most likely a lawsuit coming on this. And so how much do you change the rule that you can get it through without having a re-proposal requirement and so forth? It's a tricky situation for the Fed, but according to the Fed, they're moving forward with it.
This is remarkable. So what's going to happen in this hearing? This is going to be pretty chippy, I'm guessing.
So there's obviously the Basel III question, but then you got the FDIC. The FDIC, there was a report that came out this week talking about the toxic culture over at the FDIC. You're going to see a lot of Republicans push for Chairman Grumer to resign. Right now he does have support of the Democrats, and from an investor point of view, him leaving or not only really just depends on the ability of Basel III to get out or not. I'm also interested to hear what the conversation about the incentive compensation rule that has come out is. Representative Velasquez has been pushing the FDIC quite a bit on this. Now, the FDIC can say, look, we've put this proposal out. It's a proposal. I'm using air quotes on if you can't see me on the radio, because it's not exactly, they're not publishing it in the Federal Register, so it's more of like a request for comment. But this incentive compensation proposal will allow Chairman Grumer to say, look at me, I've done all this great stuff. You can blame the Fed here. They didn't do it. By the way, don't ask me any questions about the culture over at that.
So it sounds like this is going to be a toxic hearing that this is going to be high drama and everyone's going to be recording a commercial while they're at it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is also one of the last remaining hearings that you're going to get these regulators before the election. And so, not only are you going to press on these rules, but you're just going to press on government overreach, a lot of the regulatory issues. I mean, the Basel III endgame in particular, because when the regulators proposed it, it was a 19% capital increase for the U.S. banks. Compared to what they've done in Europe, it's around 3 to 4%. And I think in order to get this proposal out by August, they're going to have to drop that to maybe around 7 or 8%, but just more in line. But the question is, how are you going to do it and get it past the courts? And so I think some Republicans out there, if they're not going to take shot at FDIC Chairman Gruenberg, they're going to go to Michael Barr at the Fed and say, how are you going to do this? Because we're suing you, not we, the industry is suing you, and we'll sue you. How are you going to get your job done?
I love this. You have a podcast at BI.
Yep.
Can you tell our listeners how to find it?
Yeah.
When does it go up?
It's Votes and Verdicts. Goes out every Thursday. It's on Apple, Spotify, all Bloomberg
So there's a new one right now, just from last night.
Yep.
All right. It's worth the listen. I ask you that because you got a lot of fans around here. That's Nathan Dean, everybody, on Balance of Power. As you would expect, Dad, as we know him around here in Washington, he keeps us honest on a lot of important stories. Speaking of which, before we assemble our panel, we want to bring you up to date on world and national news. For that, we leave you in the hands of Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Israel's war cabinet has reportedly signed off on expanding the military operation in Rafah. Con News is reporting the cabinet renewed the mandate they had given previously to Israeli negotiators to the ceasefire and hostage release talks. Sources tell Axios the cabinet approved a measured expansion. It doesn't cross President Biden's red line, but a third source says the expansion may include actions that could be interpreted as crossing a line. About 110,000 people have fled the city of Rafah in anticipation of an expansion of fighting between Israel and Hamas. UN officials say heavy fighting between Israeli troops and Palestinian militants on the city's outskirts have made aid crossings inaccessible. Police have cleared a pro-Palestinian encampment on the campus of MIT. Quinn Perrion is a student there and an organizer with MIT's Jews for Ceasefire. He says they were expecting the police, but that this won't stop them from calling on MIT to cut financial and research ties with Israel. He says he does resent those calling for the support of the Palestinian people anti-Semitism. And the star witness for the prosecution in Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial is set to testify on Monday. Former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen will be taking the stand. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks losing traction on this Friday, on track for an up week, but still a 1-point gain in the S&P. Little change there at 52.15. That's an advance now of just under 0.1%. We've got the Dow up 96, up by 0.2%, and NASDAQ lower by 30, down now by 0.2%. 10-year 4.50% with a 2-year 4.86%. Spot gold is up $18 the ounce, higher now by about 0.8%, 23.64. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 1%, 78.44 a barrel on crude. Next up on the U.S. economic front, a series of closely watched inflated data. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The spotlight will be on April's consumer price index as well as data on wholesale and import prices. Inflation is running hot again, and the Federal Reserve is holding its benchmark interest rate at a 2-decade high. Bloomberg Economics has braced for more disappointing news, especially on the cost of food insurance and medical care. In a fresh assessment, Fed Governor Michelle Bowman says the Fed should proceed carefully and deliberately fighting inflation. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Shares of Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding, that is the high-end electric car brand under Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, are higher after an expanded IPO that is the biggest U.S. listing by a China-based company since 2021. Shares of Zeekr right now are at $26.75. We're also keeping an eye on Novavax. That stock right now up by 107%. Novavax soaring after the company signed a $1.2 billion licensing agreement with Sanofi that includes commercializing a combined COVID-19 and flu shot. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow, the S&P, they're both higher. We've got NASDAQ down by 0.2%, S&P up less than 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you, sir. Happy Friday. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. We'll be back with Charlie a little bit later on this hour, of course, to keep tabs on the markets for you, as we always do. With another week of court in the rearview mirror, almost at least in New York. Today, a former White House aide, Madeleine Westerhout, continuing testimony as a prosecution witness in the criminal hush money trial that Donald Trump is enjoying right now. We've talked so much with our panel, and I'm happy to report that Rick and Jeannie are with us today about how exactly you run a presidential campaign from a courtroom. And we've seen Donald Trump do this to the extent that he can, speaking to reporters in the lobby, stop by a bodega to make a point, you maybe sign some autographs on the street, but it's keeping him from traveling. It is not, however, keeping his surrogates from talking, and this apparently is a new element here of the courtroom campaign. Bring the surrogates to you. Stormy Daniels got all the attention this week, but the thing that popped out to me, the sort of wacky element yesterday that made me think, I didn't expect I'd see that, was when the senator from Florida showed up. Rick Scott showed up in the front row of the courtroom there to be with Donald Trump, endured Stormy Daniels' testimony in person, then walked outside and held a news conference outside the courthouse, spoke to the cameras about 3 hours into the trial, talked about how he knew Donald Trump a long time before he became governor of Florida. Quote, I consider him a friend, and what he's going through is just despicable, unquote. Let's assemble the panel for their thoughts on this and many other stories today. The Friday panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Great to see you both here. Rick, we've talked about this a number of times, and you've doubted Donald Trump's ability to kind of wiggle out of this challenge here until later in the summer when he can travel and be more effective. But what do you make about this use of surrogates coming to the courthouse? The level of ask here by Donald Trump is this kind of just the latest way to kiss the ring?
Well, I think it's a number of things. One, we did see him use earlier in the trial, meetings in New York with foreign heads of state to brandish his sort of presidential image. And I think this is just sort of the next iteration of that, where people will make a pilgrimage to the trial. I wouldn't get too excited. I mean, Rick Scott's one of the very few outside of family members and campaign staff that have done this, but it's not surprising. I mean, we've seen a lot of people wanting to curry favor with Donald Trump by, making these kinds of statements and appearances in the past, and they know that Donald Trump counts who's in that audience. I guess I don't know if it's an audience at a trial, and those things mean a lot to Donald Trump. So I'm not surprised by it. I'm just not sure drawing more and more attention to a trial and the likes of this one is actually a good campaign strategy when the country already knows Donald Trump pretty much for what he is and who he is. And I'm not sure adding the element of talking about a court case is actually helpful.
Nothing would keep a Biden surrogate from showing up at court, I suspect. In this case, Jeannie, right? Just have to get there in time. To think that Rick Scott would sit in the front row on Stormy Daniels' testimony day tells you what about his relationship or what he hopes his relationship is with Donald Trump.
Yeah, he was curious as to what Donald Trump carries in his toiletry bag. I mean, I'm really not sure what to make of this. It was such a bizarre week in court. I think we all could have done without the Stormy Daniels testimony. I am one of the people who doesn't see the reason why the prosecution put her on rather. Obviously, I am not an attorney, so I will let better minds think about that. But, I think politically, this is what we see with Donald Trump and his supporters. They want to get attention. How else does Rick Scott get much attention? Show up in court, take a front seat, and show your loyalty to Donald Trump. And so there we have it. I don't think it's going to matter one bit about the campaign. I don't think Rick Scott is a tremendous asset in terms of driving a lot of eyeballs to Donald Trump, but maybe it makes Donald Trump feel better. Can't get Melania there, get Rick Scott. He'll fill in.
Well, Rick, the judge in this case, Juan Merchan, who once again ruled against a mistrial, criticized Donald Trump's attorney for not objecting in real time to Stormy Daniels when she would drop things that they had problems with. They would wait till the end of the testimony and ask for a mistrial based on certain things that were said. Now that that's not going to happen, and this is going into the record, was this a damaging week for Donald Trump? Or, as I've been asking, are we just all numb to all of this stuff post-Access Hollywood?
Yeah, I think that there's a level of expectation in the voting public around Donald Trump and who he is and his behavior. These are historical presidents. These are things he did back in 2015 and 16. So people see him as a little bit of history. They can dismiss him if you're a Trump supporter. And even if you're a Biden supporter, it's nothing that you haven't already heard. So it's not like there's some kind of smoking gun that nobody had seen or heard before. And so, yeah, I mean, they're just, I kind of echo Jeannie's statement. They're kind of uninteresting. I mean, like, you would expect to learn something, but you don't. And then you realize, well, why should we? This thing has been incredibly well vetted. If you were going to vote for him after Access Hollywood, nothing you're going to hear here is going to change your mind. That's the point. So it is what it is. As you point out at the top of this segment, it keeps him from campaigning. And at some point in time, tradition has to prevail, and running a campaign matters. He used to criticize Biden a lot for campaigning in 2020 from his basement in Delaware. Well, this is actually worse than campaigning from a basement. And so I would think that he would think even that it would be detrimental.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's going to be done, I suspect, in time for Milwaukee. We're coming up on convention season. I want to ask you both about what we're in for here. Less with regard to Republicans in Milwaukee. That's going to take place in July. If you haven't been paying attention to this yet, they're not back-to-back again this time. Republicans, middle of July. Democrats will be in Chicago in August. Jeannie, Donald Trump has got a lot of things we can talk about here that are challenging his campaign. Joe Biden does too, of course. And we've discussed this at length when it comes to Israel specifically. The pro-Palestinian protests that we've seen around the country, including right in New York at Columbia, have been a very real optical and political problem for him. And we're gearing up for what could be a major security concern around the DNC in Chicago. Politico is reporting on that this morning, giving us a sense of what's going to go into this. How much should Democrats be worried about Chicago with already comparisons to 1968?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, I have told you, Joe, I never understood. I love myself some Chicago. Don't get me wrong, great city. Why would you choose Chicago? Illinois is not a swing state. Georgia is. I long thought they should have been in Atlanta, but that ship has sailed. So there they are in Chicago. You've got everybody under the sun, including Bernie Sanders, talking about comparisons to 1968. When I talk about conventions, the one thing you always say is, gosh, you don't want a repeat of Dems Chicago 1968 and the chaos that was. But there they are. And I know Kaylee talked earlier this week on the show to Pritzker, and he said, everything under control,
That's
not
right.
going to be an issue. And, obviously they are preparing early. I have faith that Chicago can do this well. But for Democrats, just the memories, maybe I'm old, the memories of that is what is haunting. So maybe they turned the page and they're able to make a new, show of what a convention in Chicago can be. But it does bring back really, really hard memories for Democrats at a time when issues of chaos and rioting and all of those things abound and are a big challenge for Joe Biden.
Rick, you've run a convention. You know what this is all about. They're talking about taking extra precautions this year, putting certain elements on tape, for instance, because they're concerned about protests erupting on the convention floor. How would you be approaching this as an organizer?
Yeah, this is a nightmare waiting to happen. The media loves to report on any little thing that happens on the floor of the convention. Some disgruntled delegate gets a hold of a microphone or an interview, and it causes all kinds of pain and anguish with the campaign. And not to mention what happens on the outside. I mean, the worst thing you can do is direct attention on the outside of the convention so that you're not getting your message that you've paid a very high price for that's being displayed inside the convention. And so they have these dual problems. They're going to create an alternate convention. So they'll have a little bit of activity going on inside, pre-programmed elements, especially if anything goes wrong, that they could produce in advance and play. And they're even talking about displacing the convention. So, some of it will be at the United Center, maybe others at McCormick Place, kind of divide up maybe the protesters so they're not all concentrated one location. And all of this on top of the fact that their convention comes after the filing deadline for the general election in Ohio. And so they may actually have to technically nominate the president and the vice president in order to be able to be on the Ohio ballot, which I would say is, pretty important one way or another. This is tough.
The news about Nikki Haley, Rick, is she going to play a role in this convention? She's meeting with donors next week, according to the Wall Street Journal. Having gotten 22% of the vote on Tuesday in Indiana, she has not endorsed Donald Trump. Is there going to be a deal at some point here on where her delegates will go?
I don't get the impression the Trump folks really care. Normally you're spending your time consolidating the party now and making sure everybody's on board, everyone gets a role in the campaign, everyone's a surrogate. And they've kind of left Nikki out there to hang, and she's kind of hanging. I mean, kind of the Energizer bunny of the primary. She keeps getting 15, 20% of the vote. I don't think it really affects the general election in any way, but it's a bit of an embarrassment, an eyesore for the Trump campaign where, you want to have consolidated all of this. You don't want there to be these little stories that keep popping up about the fact that he hasn't gotten 100% of his party behind him, and her little donor event, which is just a nice thing to do to thank the people who gave you money, turns out to be like an alternate campaign event. And so, Trump's got some problems inside the party, and it doesn't appear that he really cares to mend them. So why doesn't she enjoy that fact?
Jeannie, Nikki Haley and Donald Trump did not speak when she dropped out of the race in March. They have still not spoken. Should the Biden campaign be reaching out to her?
No, I don't think it's going to make a difference. Sure, they can reach out, but I think Nikki Haley has been clear. She wants a future in the Republican Party. I think part of this is a reflection of the fact that we are in the longest general election in modern American history. And so, even small breaks and when we see this with Nikki Haley and Donald Trump on the Republican side, or with Joe Biden and the people who are frustrated with his Israeli policy on the Democratic side, it does give the media something to talk about. I'm not sure, it matters that much in the end, in part because, as Rick just said, Donald Trump doesn't really care. And he's shown no signs of wanting to reach out. I think until and unless she made real inroads to him, I doubt we would see him respond or do much about it.
Well, by God, we care, Jeannie, and we're going to keep talking about this and covering it right here. With our signature panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. Fascinating conversation there. We're going to do it again next hour. We'll have the panel back after we spend some time with Robert McWhirter, the criminal attorney, with more on Donald Trump's case. And we did just have an important headline cross the terminal. Trump prosecutors say they could rest their case next week. Remembering it was originally supposed to last 6 weeks, this trial. We'll have a lot more straight ahead on Bloomberg.
world of politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
New tariffs on China could hit as soon as next week. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the Biden administration prepares to unveil these new levies on EVs, on batteries, on solar cells. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. And Kaylee, it looks like the administration here is trying to differentiate itself from the Trump tariffs by being surgical instead of this across-the-board approach. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, keeping in mind the Biden administration has left intact the tariffs that were put in place on Chinese goods under the Trump administration. But whereas Donald Trump is saying, I'm going to tariff everything coming out of China, something like 60%,
yes,
the Biden administration is looking at a few key specific industries. It's worth pointing out, Joe, that a lot of this may be more symbolism than actually something that will affect the import of Chinese goods into the U.S. because a lot of them aren't in the Chinese or the U.S. market right now.
That's
because
true.
of the tariffs that are already in place.
Well, specific to EVs, we're talking about a potential fourfold increase according to the Wall Street Journal. And what a bit of timing today, Kaylee, to see this Chinese EV maker Zeekr go public at the NYSE. We're going to talk to their CFO a little bit later on this hour with a lot of questions we have about timing and why this is happening at all.
Yeah, not just the questions around tariffs, but also why they're choosing to come list in the United States, given all the concerns that Chinese firms and their ADRs have had here, questions around auditing, potentially getting delisted from exchanges. Remember when Didi went public and then very quickly had to delist? So we have a lot to talk about this hour. And we also have to check in on the Trump trial that is underway still in New York. We'll have the latest on that. First, though, also in New York, let's get the latest on the markets. Charlie Pellet has a look at that for us. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Kelly. We're looking at an up week, 3 in a row for the S&P 500 index, and up Friday for now. Little changed on the S&P 500 index, higher by 4 right now, up less than 0.1%. We got the Dow Industrials up 107, up 0.3%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 18, drop there of 0.1%. Bottom line here, the U.S. stock market is running out of steam amid stagflation chatter. The 10-year, 4.50%, with a 2-year right now, 4.86%. We've got spot gold up $21 the ounce, $23.67 right now. That is an advance of 0.9%. Crude oil lower now by 1.1%, below $79 a barrel, $78.38 right now on WTI. Shares of Sweetgreen, the salad chain, are surging after last night's earnings report. Sweetgreen up now by a sweet 33.6%. We're also keeping an eye on Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding, the stock you guys were talking about at the top of the show. Zeekr, first day of trading went out at 26, right now 27.49 for Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding. Again, recapping, looking at a mixed Friday here. The Dow, the S&P, they are both higher. S&P barely. We got Nasdaq in the red, down now by 0.1%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the markets and the trading action we are seeing in the debut of Zeekr. Again, Joe and I will be speaking this hour with Jin Yuang, the CFO of that Chinese company that is listing here in the U.S. today. And what a day for that interview to happen, Joe, as we also had great reporting from our team here at Bloomberg overnight about what this administration is looking to do with tariffs on a number of things, but electric vehicles coming from China being one.
I'm scratching my head on this one. We're talking about a potential fourfold increase in EV tariffs, and we've got a Chinese EV maker going public today. I'll save my questions on that for later. Josh Wingrove is helping with our reporting from the White House, though, of course, Bloomberg White House correspondent is with us at the table right now with more on this. And Josh, this could happen as soon as next week, is what you're telling us. Will these all be rolled out in one event? How is this communicated by an administration that might not want to look like the Trump White House, right?
That's our expectation. It's going to be one event. Remember, they've already given a teaser with that announcement on steel and aluminum a few weeks ago in Pittsburgh, and so we think that they're going to roll these out. Right now, the tariff on Chinese auto EVs is 27.5%. So quadrupling that, big number. I mean, it's still, I guess, possible that given sometimes the rate or the cost of producing goods there, that they could still try to find their way to be competitive. But this is really about sort of heading off what they expect to be, both in steel and aluminum, as well as cars, an increase that's coming as opposed to a market that already exists. I'm sure they'll frame it like, you don't wait for the hurricane to hit before you put the storm windows up, right? And they are expecting China to try to sort of dump its way out of its woes right now when it comes to steel and aluminum, and potentially try to overtake the auto sector. And as we know, the auto sector in every country has been a closely guarded political thing for quite some time. The 2024 overlays here are strong, but this is a big one. This is one of the biggest things Joe Biden has done on China in his administration.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that while we have had this administration taking this more targeted approach, it is in some ways, while they're both being protectionist, slightly more muted than Donald Trump, who says, okay, blanket everything with 60% plus tariffs. I'm potentially going to put 100% tariffs on all vehicles, he said in the past. What would hold the Biden administration back from doing something that intense or extreme?
Inflation, in part. I mean, that has been the argument against this. You start tacking on these things. Trump always said China's paying these tariffs. Of course, that's not the case, right? Tariffs are paid by the importer and passed on in part or in entirety to the consumer. So that was sort of hanging over this as well. I think one thing here that Biden has been weighing is, this is about sort of like a strategic long-term competition. You go back and watch everything Catherine Tai has said, everything Janet Yellen has said, and they talk about China sort of flooding the zone in key sectors, trying to corner the market on critical minerals, on overcapacity, key whatever. And they're trying to box the U.S. out and thinking long-term in a way that Western democracies don't always do or have the luxury to do. So right now, I think that is the lens on this. So autos, remember, of course, Michigan, key battleground for the 2024 election. If Joe Biden announces this, I'd be surprised if we didn't see him in Michigan pretty soon after talking about it. And then these other critical sectors, again, solar cells, we understand, is going to have a higher tariff rate, and maybe some battery components. It's still a little unclear. Other products could also see increases. We just don't know the full list, and we don't also know how much it's jumping. One final thing is that one scenario here was, well, Joe Biden might raise some on critical industries, key battleground type of industries, and lower others on more benign consumer goods, and try to make it a wash overall to mute the reaction in China and perhaps mute the risk of retaliation that could hit, for instance, American farmers, as it did in the first Trump sort of trade spat with China. Our reporting is that's not the case. They're not exploring large-scale reductions in other categories that would offset the increases that they're planning.
That's fascinating. So this presidential campaign will in part be the battle of the tariffs.
And the battle over who can look tougher on China.
Who can be tougher.
Right. And they both want to look tough on China.
Would Joe Biden be doing this if it weren't for Donald Trump? You mentioned Michigan. He could potentially, you could see a world in which he had gone there on his own. But Donald Trump started this.
I think Joe Biden would bark up this tree either way. I mean, I'm reminded of the steel discussion and the Japanese buying U.S. steel. I mean, Joe Biden is an 81-year-old guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who doesn't like the idea of selling U.S. steel. And I think that is informing a lot of his approach. Joe Biden, under Obama, was tasked with rescuing the auto sector. The idea of Chinese EVs, putting aside the potential data concerns that a lot of people have with them, but just simply the market share question, Joe Biden, I don't think, would have liked that as well. So, we do have bipartisan consensus on a lot of these things, right? Biden and Trump are both using these tariffs. Of course, Biden's essentially deciding to keep in place the vast majority of the Trump tariffs, which, of course, a lot of Democrats didn't necessarily love when he put them in. So there is agreement here, kind of a rare point of agreement, to say the least, between the two of them.
Finally, when we're talking about the industries, at least that we know of, that your reporting indicates, EVs, solar, batteries that will power these green technologies, doesn't the Biden administration want more of these technologies in the United States, right? They want to transition. They want to reach net zero within a certain number of years. By holding China back from being able to enter this market, does it actually run counter to some of those goals that they have?
This is one of the things that they're grappling with and why we will be paying such close attention. I would love to tell you right now. I would love to tell you. So right now, we just don't know what solar and battery type goods they will maintain or maybe even potentially reduce tariffs on because they're critical for feeding American growth in that sector versus ones that they're going to raise tariffs on to keep them out from undercutting the sector. It's a balancing act, and right now we just don't know how they're going to split it up.
All right. Well, great reporting from Josh Wingrove and our team here at Bloomberg. He, of course, covers the White House for us. Absolutely fascinating. And to his point, Joe, the idea that everyone wants to be a hawk on China, and that doesn't just go for the presidential race. You could say the same about Congress as well. And protectionist policy, regardless of what administration ultimately we end up with come January 2025, it's probably going to be a common denominator.
Well, that's absolutely right. And you've been seeing the solar stocks, among others, move on this. just incredible to think that, we're reminded in our last hour, this is the longest general election campaign in modern history. And we're going to be having conversations like this for months further, which could be a real strain on our relationship with countries like China.
Yeah, and not only is it the longest election campaign and general election campaign in history that makes this remarkable, it's also the first time we've ever seen a former president and current presumptive Republican nominee in criminal court at the same time that this general election campaign is underway. Because yes, it's another day in court in New York in the hush money trial of Donald Trump after Stormy Daniels had 2 days of testimony and cross-examination earlier this week. We understand that Michael Cohen, his former attorney and fixer, will be testifying on Monday. So where exactly do things stand for the prosecution and defense? Joining us now here on Balance of Powers, Robert McWhorter. He is a criminal and constitutional law attorney. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's always great to have you here, Robert. Let's just begin with Stormy Daniels. Considering the salacious nature of much of her testimony, the attempts of the defense to actually have a mistrial declared over it, does she end up helping or hurting the prosecution's case more from what you saw?
Well, I think that she certainly helped the prosecution's case. I don't think that the defense was very good at really attacking her or her credibility. She was able to hold her own ground, and I think she very well kind of presented what those facts were. But I do think it's important to put this in context, which is even if you do not believe anything that Stormy Daniels says, it does not mean that Mr. Trump did not commit a crime here. What seems the defense doesn't seem to dispute that he paid $130,000 to Stormy Daniels. Now, either he was doing it because he had slept with her and he didn't want that story to get out, or like he's trying to imply that she's an extortionist and he paid it in order to keep that story from getting out. It doesn't matter because it's still a campaign finance violation. You kind of put out $130,000 as a benefit to a campaign. You got to report that. And the heart of this case is actually Mr. David Pecker's testimony and the paper trail they have showing all of this catch and kill kind of little scheme, which was a benefit to Donald Trump's presidential campaign that was unreported under campaign finance laws. And whether you believe Stormy Daniels or not is irrelevant because he's not disputing that $130,000 went out the door from him. So it's really interesting. And the prosecution has really put together a very smart case. It's not just about some misdemeanor with Stormy Daniels. It's about violating campaign finance laws, which are felonies.
Does Donald Trump need new lawyers? Robert, I don't know if you're available right now, but Juan Merchan, the judge, made it pretty clear that they're not doing their job very well, calling for mistrials instead of objecting in real time to witnesses like Stormy Daniels. Are they doing a disservice to Donald Trump?
Well, they most certainly are, but I think that's just part of a silly tactic. Everybody knows you object at the time the testimony comes out to allow a judge to take corrective action. If you want to make a drama out of the mistrial theme, because this is Donald Trump's political theme, it's a witch hunt, it's bad, it should be a mistrial, blah, blah, blah. Well, then you hold off doing your proper objections and then object and ask for a mistrial because, asking for a mistrial is way more sexy than just giving some objection during testimony. So I just think it's just part of the show, to be honest with you. The quality of his lawyering, well, that's an open question. Donald Trump is an impossible client. I mean, reports that you get is he's angry with his lawyers for not being aggressive enough. I think that's just silly. And his lawyers wouldn't be serving him if they were. So does he need no lawyers? I don't know. I'm not sure I'd be available for him. So.
Oh, we got that cleared up.
Well, as we speak, Robert, and our audience on Bloomberg Television could see Donald Trump is actually outside the courthouse right now addressing the media, appears to be reading some papers and holding them up for the cameras to see, of course, if he says anything relevant. We will bring that to our television and radio audience. And once trial proceedings wrap up for today, Robert, come Monday, we understand Michael Cohen will be on the stand. He has been pegged or at least described as the prosecution's star witness. Considering what we saw, though, in the defense's cross-examination of Stormy Daniels and knowing there are questions around the credibility of Michael Cohen, given, for example, he spent time in jail, how difficult is it going to be for for the prosecution and for the defense to deal with him as a witness?
Well, it's interesting. Michael Cohen, I believe, is a much more important witness to the actual crime than, for instance, Stormy Daniels is. But he's also pretty much an open book. We know exactly what he's going to say, and we know exactly what they're going to do to try to attack him. And he's got a pretty good public narrative about he kind of had an epiphany about his role in helping Donald Trump, and he has gone ahead and presented that. Now, it's interesting, though, because what the prosecutor has done is put a whole series of other witnesses, including Hope Hicks, to lay the foundation for what Michael Cohen says. Not the foundation for what Stormy Daniels has testified, but for what Michael Cohen says. So even if they attack him, well, I'm sorry, these payments are still going out the door, and Michael Cohen was facilitating them. And that is the crime here. So, you know, can the prosecution win points? Yes. Can the defense attack him? Certainly. But I'll give an example. There are cases, large drug conspiracies that go to trial all the time with very ugly cooperating witnesses who the jury dislikes, who are not nice people, but they believe them perfectly fine when they point the finger at other co-defendants, and there are convictions that happen that way all the time. So the jury doesn't have to like Michael Cohen. They might think he's a total scumbag, but that doesn't mean they're not going to believe his testimony about what occurred here.
Our last moment here, Robert, the prosecution says it will rest next week. Does that mean we're on time?
Oh, yes. In fact, I had predicted this case would go quickly because, one, it's a very good prosecution. Two, this is a good judge. He knows his stuff, and he doesn't waste time. I'm not sure also how much more the defense has got to say. I mean, what are they going to put on after this? So I think this trial is going to be done certainly well, I would be shocked if this trial isn't done before the end of this month.
There you have it. You've been consistent on that, Robert, and we appreciate that. He's the one who said it would be done in fewer than 6 to 8 weeks. Robert McWhirter, criminal constitutional law attorney. Thank you, as always, for coming back to talk to us, Robert. Next week, Kaylee, could be something else with Michael Cohen at last on the stand.
Yeah, we've been long waiting for it. Who knows how many days of testimony we could see from him. Again, we saw 2 full days from Stormy Daniels effectively. But if the prosecution thinks they're going to be done by the end of next week and they're going to have Wednesday off, potentially Friday too, for Barron Trump's graduation, we could be getting close to the end game here.
This is true. We'll stay in touch with Robert McWhirter on this story for you. We're going to assemble our panel next. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The stock market running out of steam on this Friday. We are on track for another winning week, 3 in a row. But right now, we are looking at the S&P little changed, up by about half a point right now, up less than 0.1%. We've got the Dow up 79, up 0.2%. NASDAQ right now lower by 30 points, a decline for NASDAQ of 0.2%. 10-year 4.50% with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.86%. Spot gold up $21 the ounce to $23.68, a gain of 0.9%. And West Texas Intermediate crude in the red down 1.2%, $78.27 for a barrel of WTI. Novavax shares are surging after the company signed a $1.2 billion licensing agreement with Sanofi that includes commercializing a combined COVID-19 and flu shot. Novavax up now by 100%. First day of trading for Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding, the high-end electric car brand under Zhejiang Geely Holding Group. That stock went out at $26 a share right now, $27.20 on shares of Zeekr. Again, recapping, we're looking at a mixed Friday here. The Dow, the S&P, they're both higher. NASDAQ in the red right now, down by about 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your hosts, Kaylee Lines and Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York. Thank you. I am Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where things might be getting a little noisier in terms of jet noise, at least at Ronald Reagan National Airport.
No.
Because guess what, Joe? For all of the talk around maybe forcing an amendment vote to make sure that no extra flights were added out of DCA and the best efforts of the senators of neighboring states, Virginia and Maryland, the Senate passed the FAA reauthorization last night, and guess what?
All the flights are in there. So I'll keep waking up when the airplanes start taking off every day, unless that becomes an earlier call next door to National Airport, where I happen to reside. I'm just wondering, the hour I spent on the tarmac last weekend waiting for a gate, does that get longer or shorter because of this?
Well, the senators from Virginia and Maryland were arguing that it would make delays.
They sure did.
Delayed.
Tim Kaine.
And cause safety issues,
Mark
too,
Warner.
is what they said.
That's correct.
Van Hollen,
not
Cardin.
happy. That's right. Look, we've had a series of, close calls on the runways here, the tarmac. I don't have to go through the wheels are falling off airplanes, but we're going to add more flights at National. Let's do it.
Can't wait. It's going to be fun.
Is our panel here? Rick Davis knows about this. So does Jeannie Shanzano. Bloomberg Politics contributors, they actually get something done on the Senate. Although, Rick, I have to ask you about this. You used to deal with these flights with John McCain, right? Getting out of National Airport. Didn't you guys widen the perimeter, the radius on this thing? Should these flights be added or what?
Yeah, John McCain was under enormous pressure when he was a Commerce chairman to add flights, and he did. And one of them actually went to Arizona, and prior to that, you had to
remember this
connection. And John McCain, to his credit, never took the direct flight after having approved it. So he didn't want people to think he was doing it out of self-interest. And kind of the opposite of the Virginia delegation you were just mentioning, who out of their own self-interest said no more new flights. So the bottom line is it's going to get more congested at National Airport. Shock and surprise.
Yep.
I just have to say, as someone who has lived in both Washington and New York, I would take Reagan National Airport over LaGuardia, JFK, or Newark, basically any day of the week. Jeannie, I don't know if you agree with me on that one, but it's also worth noting that the Senate has passed this, new flights included, yes, but now that the Senate's done this, and the House just has to pass it next to make sure this thing is reauthorized for the next 5 years, did we just see effectively all major legislative work wrapped up for the 118th Congress?
We did. First of all, Kaylee, I couldn't agree more. All of those people who live around LaGuardia, JFK, they feel your coming pain, but, they felt it for a long time up here. I think so. It's getting noisier in the skies over D.C., but quieter in Congress, as they say, because this is probably the last big bill to go out. I mean, we will, some movement on the farm bill, of course, and thinking about potentially the issue of the budget for next year, at least by far as extending the deadline beyond the election. But, that's pretty much it. And I think, you do have some people in Congress who are sad about that prospect because there's other things they wanted to get done. And of course, it is sort of, the coming end of one of the most historic Congresses in not such a great way in terms of the number of bills they've been able to pass. So, between the speaker fights, the lack of bills, it has been quite a historic Congress, and not for great reasons.
Well, we saw a lot of important things happen this week, including the attempted ouster of the Speaker of the House. And Mike Johnson has been talking about this, sat down with Politico, Rick, to talk about the experience and what he thinks might follow it, remembering that he was saved in part with the help of Democrats. Here's Mike Johnson in his conversation with Politico.
Look, we have a job to do here. We have to govern. I'm glad that was done. Let's rip the Band-Aid off and get it done. I regret that it had to come to that. I spent a lot of time talking with Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene and even Paul Gosar about it. It's the way I operated.
And now apparently he says he actually spoke with Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tom Massie, Rick, as soon as they got off the floor following this motion to vacate vote. Does Mike Johnson try to rebuild the Republican conference or just walk with the help of Democrats from here?
There's so much anxiety now within the Republican caucus, and this latest attempt by Marjorie Taylor Greene to top of the leadership has only exasperated this. These people really dislike each other. There's no putting Humpty Dumpty back together again in this caucus. And in so much as they're going to make it to Election Day, and if Republicans win the majority in the House, they're going to have to really look inside and say, how are we going to manage this? Whether there's one majority leader, one vote that gets them into majority, or if it's 10, they still have a massive split in their caucus. And so I think it's really going to be incumbent upon Johnson just to keep the boat afloat between now and Election Day. Don't cause any more consternation than you have to. And I'm sure he was telling those members who tried to oust him, like, can we just focus on the elections and not focus on, your sort of party tricks that make you get more clicks in your social media, and let's just get down to the business of governing. So there is a frustration within the Republican Party with each other, much more so than with the Democrats, which I think was reflected in this interview where he talks about Hakeem Jeffries in a very glowing terms, unlike how he talks about some of his own Republican caucus members.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable to hear the not reverent, but at least kind language for some of the Democrats in this interview, Jeannie. But as Rick was just talking about how he basically, Mike Johnson was probably to all of his colleagues, look, you just need to focus on the campaign. It is, after all, an election year. And right now, the prevailing thinking is that the House is more likely to flip back to the Democrats than to stay in Republican hands, just given the map, given to what you were speaking to earlier, Jeannie, the dysfunction, the general lack of legislative work that has been done over the last year and a half. If they don't do much going forward, can they do anything to change that status quo assumption, to change the mind of the opinion of this Republican-led House of Representatives?
Yeah, I don't think they can change the view people have of the dysfunction that has been the House. That's why they all want to get out of there, get back to their districts, and do something that our representatives do quite well across the board, which is serve constituents. That's why they have really high reelection rates. I think it's going to be a close election. I have to tell you, I was struck by the fact in that interview that Mike Johnson, is hearkening back to, Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan. He wants a time in Washington that no longer exists. And I'm worried about him, quite frankly, because he didn't pay as much lip service to Donald Trump as he may need to retain his position should they win. Like when they asked him about the issue of Jack Smith, he was like, yeah, no, nothing we can do. We're not going to go for that. So, I think there's some real questions here. And since Rick likes to read truths now, we know that Donald Trump has been speaking to that. And the video that was out there, him saying he just loves Marjorie Taylor Greene. So if I was Mike Johnson, I would hug Donald Trump a little closer if he wants to keep this job going forward, whether as Speaker or Minority Leader.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, I have hope. Rick and Jeannie and Kaylee, who, by the way, interviewed Senator Raphael Warnock earlier this week. And a very important announcement this morning. And I'll bet you Rick has memories of this. Raphael Warnock Democrat from Georgia, and Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, of course, are going to be national co-chairs of National Seersucker Day. And that's, of course, a big deal in the U.S. Senate. The 11th annual, Rick, it'll be celebrated June 13th. It's things like Seersucker Day and the great Senate tradition that keep the gears turning in Washington. Am I wrong?
I'm trying to choose between my pink pinstripe seersucker or my blue pinstripe seersucker, but you'll see me in it on Bloomberg.
That's a big promise. Now I have a lot to live up to there. I'm not sure I could pull that off like Rick.
So maybe when Rick is back in the 5 p.m. edition of Balance of Power, we'll have seen an outfit change, perhaps, Rick?
June 13th.
Is that a commitment?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have to respond?
He's pleading the fifth.
Exactly. Okay. You're on the record, Rick. I don't think most Americans knew there was a pink seersucker, actually. We're learning a lot as we go here. I think about the blue and white. Are you with me there?
Yeah, sure.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you for humoring us, as always, and for the great analysis. Our signature panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors, June 13. Kaylee, put it on the calendar.
All right, there we go. Indeed, it is on the calendar. We still have a lot on our calendar for this hour.
Yes,
by the way, we have to talk still about geopolitics, as we have seen a big week in news regarding the U.S. and Israel specifically. Dale Buckner, the CEO of Global Guardian, is going to be with us in just a few moments.
Fascinating insights from someone with a lot of experience. And later this hour, Kaylee, our interview with the chief financial officer of Zeekr, the big Chinese IPO today, as we're at the same time reporting the expectation of Joe Biden to potentially quadruple tariffs on Chinese EVs in the next week. This will be a fascinating conversation. We're looking forward to it.
Indeed. First, though, let's get some world and national news now. Amy Morris has that in our 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Kaylee. Israel's war cabinet has reportedly signed off on expanding the military operation in Rafah. Khan News is reporting the cabinet renewed the mandate that they had given previously to Israeli negotiators to the ceasefire and hostage release talks. Sources tell Axios the cabinet approved a measured expansion that does not cross President Biden's red line. However, a third source says the expansion may include actions that could be interpreted as crossing a line. The UN says northern Gaza is already in a state of, quote, full-blown famine, so more than 1 million Palestinians sought refuge in Rafah in the south. Now about 110,000 people have fled that city, too, as heavy fighting between Israeli troops and Palestinian militants on the city's outskirts has left aid crossings inaccessible and food and fuel supplies critically low. UN officials warn the lack of fuel is now undermining medical facilities, water supplies, and sewage systems across Gaza. Jurors are gone for the day in Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial in New York. The judge now looking over the schedule. Prosecutors say they only expect to call 2 more witnesses and that they could rest their case by the end of next week. The prosecution's star witness is set to testify on Monday. Former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen is expected to testify about his role in arranging a $130,000 payment back in 2016 to adult film actor Stormy Daniels. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris and this is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are looking at a mixed market on this Friday. The Dow, the S&P, they are both higher. We've got NASDAQ trading lower right now. NASDAQ down 30. Drop there of 0.2%. We are on track for another winning week. 3 in a row on the S&P. Little change right now, up by 1 point. That is a gain of less than 0.1%. Dow Industrials up 87, higher by 0.2%. 10-year 4.49%. The 2-year 4.85%. Spot gold up $23 the ounce, up by 1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 1.2%, 78.28 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line, stock market losing traction. Bond yields are rising after data this morning pointed to an economy that is slowing. Sweetgreen shares are surging after the salad chain increased its annual sales projection and improving profitability as it seeks to expand its footprint. Sweetgreen shares, they're up now by 33%. Also keeping an eye on Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding. That is the high-end electric car brand under Zhejiang Geely Holding Group. First day out, went public at 26. Right now it is trading at 27.30 a share. Again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P both higher, NASDAQ lower, S&P right now up by 1 point. Balance of Power continues, the Friday edition. Back we go to Washington once again. Your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie, thanks for that. We'll keep tabs with Charlie and midday trading, of course, on Wall Street, as we do always here on Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we are still waiting for word on a potential ceasefire. And now there is an expectation that the State Department will soon submit a report to Congress that could be highly critical about Israel's conduct in Gaza. Kaylee, this is something that is following Joe Biden as president and as a presidential candidate, and got a lot more complex this week. This report could make this more difficult yet.
Absolutely. Of course, we heard from President Biden in his CNN interview earlier this week about the paused shipment of bombs that the U.S. For now has put on hold to Israel. He said these have been used to kill civilians in Gaza. And part of the reason that the U.S. is not sending them, at least at this time, is out of concern of how they may be used against a city in which there is more than 1 million Palestinian civilians currently taking shelter. They're very concerned about Rafah and are, of course, repeatedly warning the Israeli government and the Israeli army not to conduct a massive operation there. But in the face of that, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is still sounding rather defiant. He had this to say in an interview just yesterday.
I've said in the Holocaust memorial service that we had the other day, I said in the Holocaust we stood alone, but we were defenseless. And today, if Israel has to stand alone, we'll stand alone.
That was on the Dr. Phil program.
Yes.
Kaylee, which is really incredible when you consider the optics there, the audience they were trying to reach. I know they apparently have a long relationship, but that was not by accident.
No, certainly not. And of course, he has also said in his commentary over the last day or so that Israel will fight tooth and nail. If they need to, because they have a fight, of course, that they are looking to finish. We want to get more perspective on this now with Dale Buckner. He is the CEO of Global Guardian. He also is a retired Army colonel. Dale, thanks so much for coming to us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. When we consider what this Rafah operation ultimately may look like, what difference does the receipt of these U.S. weapons or not ultimately make?
Kaylee, in the short term, I don't think it makes a lot of difference, and here's why. 69% of all of the military support that Israel has comes from the United States. They have a lot of munitions as of right now. So as you think about going in, if the United States was to stop as of this week, sending 2,000 to 3,200-pound bombs, that's the primary thing that's being pulled back. In the short term, it doesn't make much difference. Now, if this goes on for another 6 months, a year, 2 years, and/or the Israelis then turn north and, as discussed previously, start to then escalate towards Lebanon, then it would have a real long-term effect.
We've been hearing about shelling in Rafah. We've been hearing about the IDF controlling the gates on the Egyptian border in Rafah and other operations that have been happening inside the city. Is the invasion of Rafah already underway?
So it is underway. It's very limited. If you look at the map in the southeast corner down near the Rafah gate, so far the IDF has gone into in a very limited capacity. Now, as discussed and just recently announced today, the War Cabinet has approved a larger scale operation. That being said, don't expect a massive IDF invasion overnight or in the next few days. You have to understand there's about 4 to 6 battalions of Hamas left. And more importantly, and this is really the key, tactically, the remaining hostages that we believe are alive, and those 4 to 6 battalions are all in a very small area. So as you think about this, this is where precision will matter, and this is where you can expect you're trying to thread the needle, where you're trying to take out and attrit the Hamas fighters that are left. At the same time, the real risk of dropping large munitions is you could start killing Israeli hostages. This is going to be very difficult.
Well, and even if you are trying to be precise, Dale, what we consistently hear about Hamas is that they use women and children as literal human shields, that they specifically have their operations based in areas in which there is a high likelihood of collateral damage. Is there, I guess my real question is there any way that Israel can do this, can take out the remaining battalions without that death toll going higher than the north of 30,000 it already is?
Yeah. I think that you can, on the outskirts and the perimeter of this, you can continue to attrit Hamas, especially if they have good intelligence. Now, where it gets really messy, and make no mistake, war is messy. As precise as it appears to be on video games, that's not the real world. And we've already experienced this now since October 7th. Trying to separate civilians and hostages is almost an impossible task. So to your point, Kaylee, I think that on the perimeter, you can continue to put pressure. Ultimately hoping, as you think about the negotiations, we're probably down to 2 or 3 key terms as we look forward to trying to find a ceasefire. This is pressure on the outskirts. As I talked to Joe last time, Netanyahu has been saying for several months now he's going into Rafah, and he hasn't, not at scale. Now it's limited. Now I think you see attacks in the periphery continue to attrit, put pressure diplomatically and from a military standpoint, and ultimately try and find a path to a negotiation while applying limited tactical pressure.
Dale, we've been focused on the South for the balance of this conversation. Are you hearing anything new about Israel moving to the north? And if it does, in fact, decide to make a move on Hezbollah, will it be this type of approach, starting small before going to scale?
Yeah, so if you're watching closely, there's been an escalation in the north. 3 IDF soldiers have now been killed in the last 24 hours. There is increases in attacks, both sides. So yes, as we've talked, Joe, there's a movement afoot. It's limited. And to your point, I do think this starts out in a limited capacity as they figure out, again, you have different agendas being played out. You have a political agenda, you have a humanitarian agenda, a diplomatic agenda. All these things are not aligned right now, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens next. No one knows when and how, but there has been an escalation on that Lebanese border, and depending on how this pressure in the south and the negotiations go, that will be an indicator of what might be next steps in the north with Lebanon.
Stay tuned to this space for more on that. Dale Buckner, it's great to see you. Dale, thanks for coming back to talk to us. As the CEO of Global Guarding and a retired Army colonel with experience in the field that matters to his insights here on this. Kaylee, it's really something. We're talking so much about Rafah here. People's eyes aren't on the north, where the real headlines could be coming in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, it's important to keep your eye on the many balls that could potentially be in the air. There is so much potential for surprise in a conflict like this. As we were just hearing from Dale, war is messy. And of course, we've all come to understand just how messy over the course of the 7 months between October 7th and now.
That's for sure. Kaylee, one of the other major stories that we're following here, tariffs that could come as soon as next week, according to Bloomberg's reporting against Chinese goods, including EVs. The Wall Street Journal reporting more specifically, EV tariffs could increase some 4-fold, which would bring them beyond 100%. If you do the math, this could be a major problem in our trade relationship. And Kaylee, that's why the timing of a Chinese EV maker today going public at the NYSE is quite remarkable.
Indeed. Zeekr, of course, debuted trading earlier today after an IPO at $21, trading at about $27 a share. So certainly a positive debut, despite of news that potentially could bring a potential headwind to a company like
Well, yeah, that's right. Now that the shares are trading, we're joined by the Chief Financial Officer at Zeekr, Jing Yuan, who's with us live from the New York Stock Exchange right now. Mr. Yuan, welcome to Bloomberg. It's good to see you here. With everything that I just mentioned, the expectations of tariffs rising, particularly on EVs, maybe fourfold next week, considering our deteriorating economic relationship with China. Is this the worst timed IPO of all time?
Yes, if you think about timing, we at Zeekr never try to time the market or trace the latest trends. I mean, we follow our own strategies. If you think about overall, say for example, overall Chinese EV market, if you read the numbers in the first half of April, in China, the passenger vehicle market records a new energy vehicle penetration rate of more than 50%. If you look at my pipeline, I've introduced my all-new 111 in February this year, and earlier this year, in 1st of January, started delivering my all-new 777. So my pipeline is also very strong. And if you think about my international expansion strategy, we've been starting selling cars to international markets since last October. And sorry. And in this year, we're going to sell more cars. So we need this kind of transparency brought by a U.S. listing. All in all, we do think it's a good time. We're not considering about short-time headwinds. We think in long term and trying to make sure that in the long run we make a very, very good business case.
Well, sir, as you talk about how you're expanding to international markets, considering the existing tariffs in place in the United States, the country in which, as of today, you are now listed, and it potential that tariffs go even higher, are you now listed in a market that you may never actually be able to enter and be competitive in because of those tariffs?
Yeah, so we are not entering this market, or we are not just listed in the U.S. because we want to enter into U.S. market. We get listed in the U.S. as mentioned earlier. We're thinking about all the transparencies being the U.S. listed public company, all those securities that I receive, and the comfortable I can provide to global regulators that I am a transparent and basically very good global corporate citizen. We think that is actually more important.
Mr. Yuan, the reality check seems to come in your prospectus here as Zeekr warns investors that the Chinese government could, in fact, intervene in its business to further its own regulatory, political, and societal goals. Sir, why would a U.S. citizen ever invest in a Chinese company right now?
Yeah, so I was thinking about, if you look at the U.S. capital market, it's continued to be a very big, transparent, and probably the most liquid capital market in this world. So being a foreign issuer, we want to see if we can tap this type of markets, and we want to see, we have access to capital at time of need. Again, it's more about my strategy. It's more about long-term view rather than short-term headwinds.
Well, when we consider that long-term view, something we consistently hear warned about by the U.S. administration, including, say, the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, is industrial overcapacity in China, that potentially there's going to be too much supply, not enough demand. In your domestic market, with the rapid production we are seeing of electric vehicles, is there going to be adequate demand for you? What is your view on that situation?
Yeah, so that is something which actually differentiates us from most of my competitors. If you look at my business model, I actually do contract manufacturing, and my contract manufacturer partner is Geely Group. If you look at Geely Group as a whole, we produced 2.8 million cars last year globally. And those production capacities, currently, obviously, most of them are gasoline-powered vehicles, but in the future, it's going to transfer into new energy vehicles, especially EVs. And we are leveraging on that. We are taking that right. That's why, we do think this kind of contract manufacturing arrangement actually helps us to solve these overcapacity issues if, any of the regulators have any concern.
Well, with all of this said, Mr. Yuan, you're talking about a new stock here in the United States. We're talking about the increase in tariffs that's looming and a very challenged relationship between our two countries. Can you be honest with our listeners and viewers today? Is an investment in Zeekr an investment in the PRC?
I would say an investment in Zeekr is an investment in a very good business, an international business that have potential to expand into global, right? So we are definitely a Chinese company, but a Chinese company and PRC, government or PRC, is two different things.
How so?
Again, we are a non-state-owned enterprise trying to tap one of the largest capital markets.
But the Chinese government can intervene on your business at any time, correct?
That's a disclosure in my prospectus.
Right. So you had to put that there for a reason.
For disclosure reasons, fine. Because if you look at prospectus, a lot of other disclosures, force majeure, act of God, etc., etc. We are just trying to make sure the investors are aware of all the potential risk involved, and we're being transparent. That's one of the reasons why I'm trying to list. We have listed in this market.
All right, sir, thank you so much for joining us on this debut day in the U.S. markets. That was Jing Yuan, live from the New York Stock Exchange, the CFO of Zeekr, which debuted today and is trading right now at $27.27 a share, Joe.
You said it. We'll keep tabs on that for you, as well as our continuing coverage of the Chinese government and its relationship with the U.S. Kaylee, I'll meet you back here at 5. You know what that means. Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek at TGIF. It's been a busy week for all of us.
It has. Week's not over yet, Carol.
No.
We got a couple hours left in the trade today. We got 3 hours left in our total program of Bloomberg Business Week, and it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, it is going to be a good one. And we're going to talk a little bit about the markets because we've seen a different momentum play, if you will, this week and really for the month overall, although tempering back a little bit, I feel like. So we're going to get into that. There is a reason why it has to do with inflationary expectations, so we'll dig into that in just a moment.
Hey, also top of mind for us this hour, we're going to do a big theme for the hour, and it all has to do with China. An EV IPO out of China now trading in the U.S. Also, President Biden getting ready to ramp up tariffs on Chinese EVs. And then, Carol, investing in China through an American lens. We're going to have the founder of Core Values Alpha here with us.
I think it's fair to say there's a bit of a debate when it comes to whether or not China is investable, but we're going to get into that. And we're also going to get checked, too, on those market trends. Options Insight with Abigail Doolittle. She's going to give us the setup on this Friday, but also dig a little bit later into what the options market is telling us, specifically, Tim, when it comes to gold.
Can I just say welcome back to Carol Masser? 4 days in California, back here in New York for Bloomberg Business Week.
It was a lot of fun. We got some great interviews, some great insight, and then really fun to spend Bloomberg Technology with you in San Francisco. That was such a great deep dive into AI and so much more.
Yeah, it's all going to inform our coverage over the next hour and the next 3 hours as well. Before we get to all that, though, here's an update on the day's top business stories and also what's going on in the markets. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much. And again, big warm welcome back to both of you. Reunited feels so good. Good for the Bulls today. On track for another winning week. 3 in a row for the S&P 500 index. Right now we're higher. We've got the S&P up 3, gain there of just about 0.1%. Little change, perhaps the key takeaway on the S&P. Dow Industrials up 84 right now, up 0.2%, and NASDAQ lower by 19, drop there of 0.1%. 10-year 4.50% with a 2-year 4.86%. Spot gold up $23 the ounce, higher now by just about 1%. Spot gold $23.69 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.2%, $78.31 a barrel. Keeping an eye on Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding. That is the high-end electric car brand under Zhejiang Geely Holding Group. ADRs are higher after an expanded IPO. Went out this morning at $26 a share. Right now we've got Zeekr trading at 27.3%. That is an advance right now of 30.1%. Again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P, they're both higher. We've got NASDAQ in the red right now, lower little changed. S&P higher little changed, up 4 points, up under 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Good to be back at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Having said that, stocks, they're kind of up, but it feels a little bit more strained in terms of the upward momentum that we've seen. We have seen a bullish, I should say, month here in May. And I will say that it's a little bit being pulled back or restrained today because particularly we got a U.S. consumer sentiment report. It declined in early May to a 6-month low as short-term inflation expectations and concerns about the job market picked up. So that's, I would say, Tim, safe to say, worrying equity investors a little bit today.
It is, but look at the overall trend for the last 3 weeks. And that's a question I'm going to pose to Abigail Doolittle. She's Chief Markets Correspondent here at Bloomberg News. She joins us here in the Bloomberg studios. Abigail, how do you look at a day like today in the context of what we've seen over the last 3 weeks? Because the bulls have been in charge.
They have been in charge over the last 3 weeks. Not a lot going on right now. These bulls and bears just battling it out. And I think everybody's tired. I mean, and welcome back to both of you.
Hey, present company included.
Preach it to the choir. Speaking of, I can only imagine for the both of you. But I think that everybody's tired because, this is an interesting stat. So if we go back to the beginning of earnings season when JP Morgan reported stocks, the S&P 500 basically flat. But during that time, the S&P 500 down about 5% and now back higher, not quite at the all-time highs, but back above 5,200. If the index can hold 5,200 on the close today, that would be a potentially positive sign for the bulls. That said, I'm looking at the chart right now, and when we gapped higher off of the FOMC statement and Fed Chair Jay Powell's commentary, it appears as though that gap may fill. If that happens, then you're going to hear everybody talking about a somewhat wonky technical term, which is a double top. As you can imagine, it's two spikes up in the market, and then once you go below the low, it makes an equal and opposite measure to the downside. We don't know that that's going to happen, but that possibility is setting up right now. But if we're above 5,200, hey, the bulls may take it. The minute we go back below 5,200, I would expect it to be a pretty fast slide back down toward the recent lows of, let's see, what was it, 49.50, and then closer to that 46, now 4,700, that 200-day moving average.
Wait, so is it a 50-50 of, yeah, it could go continue to the upside,
Let
or 50-50
me pull up.
continue to the
Let me get the
downside?
crystal ball going here. I would
Which
say
you actually do have a crystal ball. It's called charts.
Because I feel like you've been not, I don't want to say negative, but more to that. There's more downward side.
Yeah, I think.
come,
I mean,
downward
even when I
momentum.
look at it now without pulling up other indicators, it looks like you have the bears, the sellers are latent. They're just really waiting to pounce, and so there's kind of some of the recent, basically the Fed meeting. So you have the RSI close to bought again, but it's still in this series from last December of lower highs. So we once again have a bearish divergence, the one that I've been talking about all year, where these highs are made on less momentum. So my thought would be that we probably will see the sellers strike when they can, whatever, whether it's CPI, whatever the piece of news is that they can use, they're going to push.
NVIDIA earnings coming our way.
Yes, they're going to push really hard. Now yields, this is a really interesting one to put into the picture, because today, of course, we have the 2-year yield up about 6 basis points, or excuse me, 5. The 10-year yield is up about the same. And this, of course, after the big slide post FOMC, investors encouraged by the idea that Fed Chair Jay Powell said that they're not going to be hiking. Now, that said, I'm looking at this 2-year yield right now, and it's holding a perfect trend line up out of the January lows, suggesting it's setting up to shoot higher, and not just shoot higher, but shoot above 5%. If this yield goes, I think that we are actually possibly setting up for a case scenario similar to what Jamie Dimon has talked about, which is 8% on interest rates. I don't know if we make it quite there, but there's something brewing in these charts that suggests to me that we could shoot higher.
Just one last quick thing. It was really fascinating to be out at Milken, and one of the things that kept coming up, and one guest in particular talking about the inverted yield curve that we have had for a very, very long time. And it was interesting how I feel like we haven't all been talking
forgotten about it, basically.
Exactly, but the significance of that, and they thought that's an important indicator that we cannot forget about.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think that same guest, possibly from Carlisle, was also talking about higher for longer, but not but because of inflation, but because of supply, that there may not be the buyers for yields. And this chart of the 2-year yield, that's actually what it matches. It doesn't match the Fed or inflation, unless it was monster inflation. It matches something, actually, I would say, a little bit more systemic. Now, this is early on. It's not confirmed, but I'm seeing it. I'm like, wow, this might come to play at some point this year, next year.
I got to go back a second. Okay. Did you say 8% rates?
Jamie Dimon did. And Jamie Dimon said about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he's called for 6, 7, and 8, and like they kind of follow and lag.
But he's not necessarily saying that's going to happen. He's saying we're prepared for that
the
range,
possibility.
The possibility.
I mean, but even his saying that, and that is what these charts are saying. So Jamie Dimon and the charts are actually saying the same thing. The rate, it may not happen. We may stay exactly where we are. In fact, there's a good possibility. Actually, I wouldn't say it's a good possibility. I would say it's a possibility that we go back lower. The reason that this 2-year yield looks like it's going to shoot higher, if we go back to 2022, it's low level that I'm looking at in terms of this formation. It's called basically a triangle. It looks like a triangle. It's right below 3%. Then the next low on the Silicon Valley banking crisis was right below 4%, and then right above 4% last year, and then you have an equidistant top. It creates this congestion, this coil where the sellers just take over and sell treasuries and yields go higher. It's basically an equal and opposite move from 3% to 5%. So let's call it 7%.
Okay.
This chart's just 7%, not 8%.
If we go back to the April letter, he talked about a range from 2% all the way up to 8%, or even more, he said. So, yes.
That's quite a range.
More, that's quite a range, yeah. And above 8%, I mean, listen, you can look at a chart. It's like a discount rate. You can make it say what you want to say. But I'm going to say fairly, there's a very good chance we see 7% over the next 12 months.
And I would say that there's a fair amount of macro factors out there that could ultimately, when it comes to inflationary expectations or pressures, that could stay out there or maybe spike at any moment. So maybe that's some of the thing. that's your setup. Abigail, thank you so much. You're going to be back a little bit later.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't go
hour.
too far, Abigail, because you're going to be back with us in just a little bit.
All right, folks, that is your market setup. We've got just under 2 hours to go until we ring the closing bell on this Friday and wrap up the trading week. We do want to get to one of the macro factors that investors continue to keep on their radar, and it is actually one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg today. It is a Bloomberg exclusive. President Joe Biden's administration, you heard our Balance of Power team talking about that. President Biden's administration poised to unveil a sweeping decision on China tariffs as soon as next week. This is according to those familiar, one that is expected to target key strategic sectors with new levels while rejecting the across-the-board hike sought by Donald Trump. This is according, again, to folks familiar. We're talking also about EVs.
Yeah, here with the details, we got Bloomberg News economic reporter Eric Barton joining us from Washington, D.C. So, Eric, Bloomberg had the story exclusively this morning. You are on that byline, and then we get a bit more on the particulars from a Wall Street Journal story that came a little later. What exactly do we know right now? What do we need to know?
Sure. What we're hearing from our sources is that this announcement could come as early as next week. We've heard from a couple of people that it is currently scheduled for Tuesday, although this is something that is really several years in the making and has been something that's continually been pushed back. So, there's always a possibility with the politics involved, the sensitivity of the U.S.-China relationship, that this could slip. But this is the result of a culmination of a review of almost a couple of years, a 4-year review of these tariffs that were first applied by President Trump starting in 2018. And they apply to more than 300 billion of annual imports from China, $300 billion. So talking about a huge amount, a big part of the trade relationship. Biden administration trying to make them more strategic, keying in on electric vehicles, on batteries, on solar cells, and trying to be more strategic and better leveraged about the kind of pressure they're putting on China to change what they see as unfair behavior and unfair subsidy and promotion of the manufacturing industry there.
Well, that's what I wanted to get to, Eric. What's the policy justification on the part of the Biden administration to take this move against China?
Well, these tariffs were originally put in place with the identification of intellectual property theft and as a way to try to get China to stop doing that. The administration, both administrations saying that American producers can compete, but that they need a level playing field. We've seen this afternoon from the Wall Street Journal a report that the electric vehicle tariff increase that we reported on last night is going to be as much as a quadrupling. In other words, going from 25% to 100% tariffs, which is a big number and a big increase. But listen, I used to live in Mexico City. If you're in Mexico and you see BYD vehicles selling for $12,000 there and Teslas starting at $45,000 in the U.S., there still is a question about how do American EVs compete and how do European vehicles, for that matter, that are also having tariffs imposed. Europe has imposed tariffs on Chinese vehicles. How do they compete against this overcapacity and overproduction in the Chinese vehicle market that's done via state sponsorship?
So, Eric, it raises the question about the efficacy of tariffs like these. We've seen past administrations, the Trump administration do this. We saw the George W. Bush administration use tariffs as well. Economic impact here, to what extent do these actually work in terms of getting goals accomplished?
Well, what we have seen certainly with the Trump tariffs was a decrease in the tariff categories, the tariff lines of goods that faced the increased duties in the previous administration. And so we've seen, a great deal of effect in terms of impacting those goods. Big question, though, is who is paying that cost? There are a lot of American manufacturers who say, hey, we've got intermediate goods that we get from China, inputs to our finished manufactured goods that are more expensive for us, hard for us to compete against manufacturers in other countries that are not having to face these tariffs on their inputs. And then a question ultimately, which has been one that the U.S. Treasury Department at some point in these deliberations focused on, which is what is the cost for American consumers? And that's one of the reasons this decision was delayed, was the concerns about inflation a couple of years ago.
Well, I do wonder, less competition, right? You do wonder what that means ultimately for all of us in terms of buying these products. Having said that, I get, some of the pushback by the Biden administration, but I got to ask you, the Biden administration increasingly getting involved with, various industries here in the United States, maybe not state state-sponsored entities, but you see certainly the support, whether it's EV tax credits. You also see the support for the semiconductor industry. So it's very interesting to see some of the policies that we are taking yet kind of pushing back against other countries and China in particular.
Absolutely. One of the hallmarks of this administration has been the pursuit of industrial policy. It's something that the U.S. has not done very well in the past, has sometimes shied away from or failed at, and yet we are seeing things like the Inflation Reduction Act, like Chips for America, trying to identify areas where the U.S. and the private sector could use a boost or an impetus from the government, and seeing the administration taking a leading role in that to try to better compete with China after decades when the feeling was that China was really out-competing the U.S. through state sponsorship.
Hey, I'm wondering, Eric, look, it's not necessarily a story about voters and a story about the election, but we're in an election year, and I'm wondering what your reporting tells you about the way that this could move the needle when it comes to November. Do voters care about this stuff?
Absolutely. The election politics are one key here. Obviously, we've seen polls identifying inflation as a big issue, as well as concern about immigration. But as we saw in 2016, trade is a sensitive issue. This is something manufacturing states often are swing states. We've seen that in the case of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so definitely an aspect of this trying to appeal to organized labor, trying to appeal to blue-collar workers, manufacturing workers, and say, we've got your back and we're going to help to protect some of those industries against unfair competition from China.
Hey, Eric, if it doesn't happen here, but it sounds like it is, I mean, should we assume no matter what happens in terms of the November election, be it Biden or Trump back in the White House, that they're going to continue to pursue a tough policy, trade policy against China?
Absolutely. That is one of the few things that I think most people would say both parties here in Washington agree on, is that the U.S. needs to be tough on China, stand up to China. We've seen President Trump, former President Trump, talking about 60% tariffs on China. So really a race between Presidents Trump and Biden about who can be tougher and who can stand up stronger against China in that trade relationship.
All right, going to leave it on that note. Listen, great to check in with you. And as we said, this story exclusively being reported by Bloomberg earlier today. Eric Martin, part of that team, putting that out there. He is economic reporter at Bloomberg News, joining us from Washington, D.C. Eric, thank you.
Hey, taking a look at the markets right now, we're seeing a little bit of red and a little bit of green on the screen. The S&P 500 higher by a little more than 0.1%. The NASDAQ just down fractionally, while the Dow up 100 points. That's 0.3% to the upside.
Yeah, you know, we talk about macro factors and certainly trade policy, geopolitics, all of this comes into play. We're going to continue digging this or digging into this in this hour. But coming up next, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into an IPO, Chinese EV. You know it. We're talking about Zeekr. That is coming up next on Bloomberg Radio and television. This is Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar, Tim Stedovic. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index on track for another winning week, 3 in a row. Right now, we've got the S&P higher by 0.1% on the week, up by 1.8%. Stock market, though, losing traction. Bond yields rising after data pointed to an economy that is slowing amid stubborn inflationary pressures. S&P again up 5, up by 0.1%. Dow Industrials up 89. That is a gain of 0.2%. NASDAQ trading lower. We've got NASDAQ down 10, a drop there of 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.50%. The 2-year 4.86%. Spot gold up $22 the ounce to $23.69, up now by 1%. On a retreat for crude oil today, down 1%, $78.41 a barrel on WTI. Ford has promoted Chief Financial Officer John Lawler to Vice Chair to oversee the automaker's long-term strategy. Ford also hired Sherry House, the former CFO of EV startup Lucid Motors, as Vice President of Finance. Ford shares down 1%. Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding, that is the high-end electric car brand under Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, higher, went out this morning, $26 a share, right now advancing to $27.88, up by 32.7%. Recapping, S&P higher by 6, up 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, just to reiterate, Charlie's been talking about it. We all have. As Tim mentioned, ticker ZK, it's definitely on our minds today. We said we've got a theme of China this hour, and we're going to continue with that. Shares of Zeekr Intelligent Technology Holding, the high-end electric car brand under Geely Holding Group, rising as much as 40% after an expanded initial public offering. That's the biggest U.S. listing by a China-based company since 2021, and we're looking at Zeekr up right now, Tim, just shy of 33%.
Okay, so let's get to our roundtable because we got a great one. We got Amy Orr with us. She's Bloomberg News equity capital markets reporter. You know, when we see her in our studio, we're talking IPOs.
It hasn't happened a lot in the last year or so.
But she's been busy with this one. Also with us is Bloomberg Intelligence Global Autos and Industrials Research Analyst Steve Mann. Steve, I do want to start with you because this is an IPO, but it's also a story about the auto industry, and especially comes at a really interesting time, given that demand for electric vehicles, especially here in the U.S., but also globally, is not what a lot of investors and a lot of analysts thought it would be in 2024. Talk to us about the timing of this company coming to market against these headwinds.
Yeah, it is very interesting. If you look at NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, all three are Chinese automakers listed in the U.S. They've been down 27 to 45% year to date. So the timing doesn't seem as very timely, but I think globally auto sales are down, especially in Europe, in the U.S., but the Chinese are still doing okay. In the last couple of months, sales have gone up, and I think Zeekr, I don't think I have plans to sell in the U.S., maybe in Europe, but this is going to help build brand cachet for the brand locally in their home market.
All right, we're going to dig into that a little bit more because it sounds like they're gunning for Tesla because it's a little bit more of a higher end play. But hang on for a second. I do want to bring in Amy Orr, who follows the IPO market for us. Amy, as we mentioned, out of the gate, strong showing. How would you characterize this? And get into that Geely has indicated that it is going to subscribe to more than 90% of the stock. So they're going to own a lot of it, it sounds. So put it all in perspective for us.
Well, so to start off with, I would say that this is one of those deals that we've been waiting for a very long time because A is EV IPO, but it's also a Chinese company of sizable size that we haven't seen in a very long time. And so it's great that it's going up. And as you mentioned, like 90% of it was already sold like before it actually started the roadshow. So which is good to actually provide a good base and foundation for the stock to go up at a time when, like Steve was mentioning, that EV is not actually particularly kind of doing well across the board.
But does it show that Geely was a little, am I saying it right too? We had some debate. Geely. Okay. We want to make sure we've got it correct because there was a little bit of a debate in the newsroom. But is it a sign too that Geely was a little concerned about maybe the interest amid kind of the broader EV backdrop?
To be honest, I would say that just IPOs as a whole has been kind of choppy, and then particularly EV. And then given that at the time of the pricing, it was only 5.2 billion in market cap, and then now it's went up to around 7 billion or so.
But not the 13 billion they were talking about a year or so ago.
Definitely far away from that. I'm sure there were conservatism right there just to make sure that there is a good base, that it was not like 3 or even below. So definitely there is a bit of that, and probably also Geely wants to continue to hold a little bit more of that, looking at the future growth of the company, especially we're talking about this is the high-end side of the market. It's not the mass market that we've seen. Bloomberg has reported before that there were some headwinds there as well. So yeah, and how to go beyond the Europe market and beyond the Chinese market, going to Europe and other places as well.
So Steve, talk a little bit about that, because it's kind of the perfect segue to what you cover as Bloomberg Intelligence Global Autos and Industrial Research Analyst. What exactly are the vehicles that are being offered? Carol did allude to the idea that they do compete with Tesla, but paint a picture of this company for a lot of people, I think, listening and watching right now, who have probably never before today heard of this company.
Yeah, Zeekr is born out of Geely. It's the parent company, Zhejiang Geely. It's related to the 175 HK that's listed in Hong Kong. I mean, they offer 2 vehicles right now. One is an SUV, one is a sedan. It's a pure battery EV. It's selling at around 37 to 40,000 US dollar in China. That's about the same price as the Model 3 and Model Y over there. I think what's really unique about Zeekr and a lot of the Chinese brands over there is they're all considered smart cars. Okay. With great connectivity, apps that resonate with consumers. Very different consumer base over there. So I think they're going to try to export that type of offering to the globe, and I think listing the shares here, it's gonna help bring the brand cachet not only in China, but it's gonna get the name out there on a global basis.
Hey Steve, people hear Geely and they think, I think Volvo here in the U.S. Then maybe they hear Volvo, they think Polestar, which is an EV that is sold here in the U.S., a pretty high-performing one.
I was in a Polestar out on the West Coast.
They're pretty cool.
Yeah.
What's the Polestar relationship with Zeekr? Like, can we think about it like a corollary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of the design cues, that's the Zeekr. A lot of technology within the Zeekr brand, EV brand, it's actually shared between Geely, between Polestar, and Volvo. And there's actually another brand called Lynk & Co. That's it's not available elsewhere, only in China. And so all those companies are actually related. Zeekr's R&D headquarters actually is in Gothenburg, Sweden.
Hey, listen, one more in the company, then I want to go back to Amy, but I do think about the Chinese EV market. How crowded, Steve, is it getting?
Oh, it's very crowded. It's a hyper-competitive market. As you probably heard, deep discountings been happening in the last year and a half. And it's interesting because the auto industry, the EV makers, the Chinese EV makers are very much vertically integrated over there. So they mine the lithium, they make the batteries, and then as well as the software. Quite different than how it works here. And I think in the earlier segment, you talked about tariffs in the U.S., and it's really necessary that the U.S. put these policies in place because to compete effectively with the Chinese, the auto industry needs to be much more vertically integrated. The supply chain needs to be much more vertically integrated than it is now. To really compete effectively with the Chinese.
Really important. You mentioned the price cuts, though. China's best-selling car maker, BYD, slashing prices across much of its lineup this year. So that is certainly the backdrop there. Amy, come on back in. An IPO market out at Milken. We talked with the M&A guys. They think it's starting to come a little bit more activity. The significance of this one actually doing well out of the gate. Is it something particular that it's Chinese, that it's an EV maker, or is it just kind of good good to just see an issue come out and actually do well in its first day of trading.
Definitely, we just want any IPO to trade well at this point, I kind of feel. But then, like, as a Chinese IPO, I would say that the biggest hurdle is not for a Chinese company to actually do well. It's really about whether Chinese government is going to really release the kind of flood of Chinese companies waiting to actually get listed here. And
Is there a lot just waiting?
Definitely. And essentially, Chinese companies used to actually form the bulk of, U.S. listings as well. And also the fact that I think Reuters, if I remember correctly, reported this earlier this morning that Shein is actually going for London as well. So essentially, these are the kind of headwinds, political headwinds that we're feeling that is going to hamper the kind of Chinese companies coming to the U.S.
So what are you watching in the next few weeks, in the next few months, as an indication from the Chinese government, from the way that investors receive Zeekr, that might indicate that we could see more IPOs from China-listed companies?
As Steve mentioned, that this company technically is not headquartered in China, but it's got very strong ties with China, that we always kind of see it as a Chinese company per se. But there are also quite a few, like I think Shein is in the same bucket as well, ByteDance in the same bucket as well, that they're headquartered elsewhere, but then we generally just see them as Chinese companies. But I don't feel that there is a floodgate being opened. Right now it's still kind of, trickle. It's on a case-by-case basis.
Hey, Steve, just 25 seconds here. Joe Matthew tried to push the official over at Zeekr about Chinese government involvement in this company, in Zeekr. What do we know? And forgive me, just got about 25 seconds.
Yeah, it's actually a private company, Geely. So, I mean, there's Chinese government's always giving subsidies. So, there are some ties, but it's a private company.
All right, gonna leave it on that note. Guys, thanks. We came at it from different sides, so appreciate it. Steve Mann out there at our Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey. Steve is Global Autos and Industrials Research Analyst. And then right here in our studio, our Amy Orr, Equity Capital Markets reporter, as we said, watching the IPO market. This, as we see, Zeekr shares, they're up, Tim, roughly about 33%, off their highs, but still holding on to a lot of those gains.
Okay, from an Amy in New York to an Amy in Washington, D.C. now. Check the latest world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in D.C. Hey, Amy.
Thank you, Tim. Israel's war cabinet has reportedly signed off on expanding the military operation in Rafah. Sources tell Axios the cabinet approved a measured expansion. It doesn't cross President Biden's red line. However, a third source says the expansion may include actions that could be interpreted as crossing a red line. About 110,000 people have fled the city of Rafah in anticipation of an expansion of fighting between Israel and Hamas. UN officials say heavy fighting between Israeli troops and Palestinian militants on the city's outskirts made aid crossings inaccessible and food and fuel supplies critically low. The lack of fuel now undermining medical facilities, water supplies, and sewage systems. The UN says the World Food Program will run out of food for distribution in southern Gaza by tomorrow unless they can get more aid in. Police have cleared a pro-Palestinian encampment on the campus of MIT. Quinn Perrian is a student at MIT and an organizer with MIT Jews for Ceasefire, and he says they'll continue to call on MIT to cut financial and research ties with Israel.
This is not in any way going to diminish the movement. We're stronger than ever. We've seen that MIT will do anything, even threaten the well-being of its own students, over divesting from this ongoing genocide.
Perrian says he resents those calling for the support of the Palestinian people, anti-Semitism. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got stocks continuing to trade mixed as they have been for much of the day. The Dow, the S&P, they're both higher. NASDAQ in the red. We begin, though, with the S&P at 52.16, on track for a winning week, up 2 points. Little change now, up less than 0.1%. The Dow up 69, up 0.2%. NASDAQ lower now by 20, a decline of 0.1%. 10-year at 4.50% with a 2-year 4.86%. Spot gold today, right now, we do have an ounce of the precious metal. It is trading higher. Gold up $22 the ounce, up 0.9%, 23.68. While West Texas Intermediate crude is down 1.1% right now, 78.34 per barrel of WTI. Novavax shares are surging after the company signed a $1.2 billion licensing agreement with Sanofi that includes commercializing a combined COVID-19 and flu shot. Right now, Novavax up by almost 100%. First day of trading for Zeekr, the high-end electric car brand under Geely Holding Group. They are pushing higher. Right now, we've got Zeekr at $22.17. Zeekr going out this morning at $26 a share, looking at an advance right now of 29.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, as we talked about earlier, our Bloomberg exclusive about President Biden getting ready to hit hard on China EVs with tariffs as soon as next week. That's according to folks familiar. The Wall Street Journal doing some reporting on this as well, saying those tariffs could quadruple. So it's one of our big stories, certainly on this Friday.
Yeah, Bloomberg News reporting today that China is losing its luster as a top country to invest in as firms seek to avoid geopolitical risks and turn to Southeast Asia and Europe, according to a survey by the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. So we thought we'd get a perspective from Ben Harburg. He's founder and portfolio manager at Core Values Alpha. He joins us where it is very early in the morning in Beijing. The Core Values Alpha Great China Growth ETF, it's got about $8 million in total assets. It's up to about 6% so far year to date.
Normal people would be asleep. I'm just going to put that out there, Ben. Anyway, we appreciate you getting up. It is hard to get your head and hands around, if you will, China being investable today, especially on a day like today where you've got a very successful Chinese EV maker IPOing here in the United States. And then you've got, of course, what seems to be more tariffs coming on that market, pushback on Chinese-made goods coming to the United States, if you will. So having said that, why is China investable in your view? Because it looks like, there isn't a lot of investor interest.
I think you have to separate the tariffs from the realities on the ground and the scale and growth of Chinese businesses and the demand of Chinese consumers. So if anything, the tariffs are the direct result of the success of Chinese companies. If I were the Biden administration, I'd also be looking to bolster American auto industry support, if that's domestic subsidies in the United States, or hitting hard on Chinese exports because they're falling behind. The Americans simply don't have that kind of vertical integration that the Chinese EVs and the kind of the case study that we're talking about have. And so the net result of all that is I think that actually belies a really strong Chinese market and a significant threat to incumbent interests across a lot of the key verticals. One would say that, for instance, a lot of the pushback against the likes of Tencent or TikTok is again driven by the success it's had against incumbents like Meta or Snap or others. So I wouldn't look too deeply into tariffs to explain the challenges facing the Chinese market, only that they might ultimately scare away some investors who see that type of headline risk.
Ben, is that the way that this is presented in Chinese media? Is it the way that you view it within China, that these tariffs and the reaction that lawmakers here in the U.S. have